You are listening to Ras Temari Radio, Offense Necessary, where we discuss everything but politics. We're here with our good friend Timothy, who was nice enough to come join us. Hi, Timothy.
And greetings and welcome to everybody. Thanks for having me.
Thanks for coming in. Timothy is of an older gentleman of Black American descent, Black American origin. You've been in the country for, what is it, about 20 years?
15 years,
15
actually.
years.
I consider Ethiopian origin. My great-grandparents were Ethiopianists.
Ethiopianists.
And Ethiopianism was the predecessor to Pan-Africanism.
And a big thing in certain sectors within the United States?
In the U.S., most of the people who followed Marcus Garvey, who followed black consciousness in the 20s and 30s, were Ethiopianists.
Is that what drew you to Ethiopia?
Initially, yes, that was one of the opening things. But as I learned more about Ethiopia and the culture and the food and different things, then that attracted me more. And then being a Rastafarian also was the final lynch.
Sure.
So,
in a sense, a different kind of diaspora, a different kind of black diaspora.
It's all connected.
It's
all connected, again, because before the Rastafari movement, really, again, and we credit our beginning to the coronation of Haile Selassie in 1930.
Sure.
You know, it was right from then that people were in the streets in different parts of the diaspora preaching the divinity of Haile Selassie and showing, the connection between Bible prophecies and the Ethiopianism that many people had already adopted.
Sure,
they
sort
took
of
it from there.
Right, Rastafarianism, Ethiopianism often would take from Old Testament discussions of Zionism, some of the same things as the sort of state of
prophecies
Israel.
concerning Ethiopia shall stretch forth her hands to God, those type of things.
Absolutely. And I remember one of our first conversations is, not too many people realize this, but when Italy invaded Ethiopia in 1936, it was, of course, one of the signal moments of Italy joining in World War II and the lead up to World War II, just as Japan attacking China or Germany going after Czechoslovakia, Yugoslavia, and Poland. And there were riots. I mean, this is hard to imagine with the current state of affairs, where many people in the younger generation in Black Americans kind of have this mentality of, we got enough problems here, and the Pan-African stuff of the early 20th century, that didn't work because there was this sort of conscious retreat to political and social rights inward in the civil rights movement that was very successful. So people think of it as, why would we do that for? But there were actually riots, as we discussed, in Harlem and in Little Italy, in certain neighborhoods in New York, clashes between Black Americans and Italian Americans over Italy's invasion of Ethiopia.
Not only New York, but most of the urban centers in the U.S., Detroit, Cleveland, everywhere there were black people who they were upset about Italy invading Ethiopia, a sovereign country, and a country who had recently joined the League of Nations.
Right.
And Haile Selassie's impassioned plea to the League of Nations was something that was played in newsreels throughout Black America. So people were conscious, especially the Garveyites, were conscious of what was going on in Ethiopia. So many even tried to enlist to come and fight for Ethiopia.
Correct.
And Colonel John Robinson was one of those who was successful because he was a pilot to be able to come on his own. And he had to give up his U.S. citizenship. But it was Haile Selassie who made him a colonel in the brand new Ethiopian Air Force, because he came with that intention to fly planes for Ethiopia.
It's a part of our history, on both sides of the Atlantic.
Exactly,
we're
connected. That
is connected, but that for whatever reason, I don't know if there's a conscious decision to do this part, that people aren't really aware of. Like when we talked about Malcolm X, there's very little discussion, even in the Spike Lee film, of Malcolm X towards the end, when he had left the nation, when he had kind of rejected Elijah Muhammad, or Elijah Muhammad had rejected him, that there wasn't just the pilgrimages they show in the film and you read about in the book, the sort of religious pilgrimage to the Middle East. It wasn't just that there were those aspects of who he was, but he was making all these efforts of going to West Africa and all that to try and bring back all the Pan-Africanism of the early 20th century. It doesn't really come up that often when people talk about Malcolm X, that those efforts at Pan-African sort of integration.
That's one of the reasons why we believe they killed him. Right. Because he was on that trajectory. He was on connecting the African liberation struggles to the African American civil rights struggle. He was saying it's all a human rights problem, and he wanted to take it to the United Nations and condemn the U.S. and condemn all of the colonial countries and systems that were keeping black people in subhuman bondage and these type of conditions. He wanted to unite all of these struggles. That's why he became more dangerous. That's why the Nation of Islam was utilized to get rid of him. But because, it's been proven that the counterintelligence program launched by J. Edgar Hoover, one of the points that they wanted to do was exacerbate friction between movement leaders.
Oh, sure.
They would forge letters.
Sure.
To one,
there was even
he's plotting things behind you. He's doing this behind your back, and they would send letters, and they would send
to the others,
through their agents, through their informants.
There was even the whole time when Hoover, I think I mentioned this to you when we talked when Hoover tried to convince Dr. King to commit suicide, because we have all this evidence on you. I mean, Hoover was obsessed with not on the one hand the Klan, right? He was trying to destroy the Klan, but he was also trying to destroy any kind of black nationalism or any kind of civil rights.
He felt anything that was extremist in right wing or left wing was damaging to the country.
Right.
And because many of the African American struggles were starting to, I wouldn't say link, but they were often sponsored by communists and communist socialist agendas.
Sure. I mean, the Panthers in particular, right? Their connection to Maoism.
They had, that was largely to connect with those intelligentsia in the universities.
Sure. Yeah.
The main focus of the Black Panther Party, if you read their 10-point program, is land, food, shelter, improvement of the ghetto experience.
Sure.
Breakfast programs were started, ambulance programs were started,
communitarianism.
It was all about community. Yeah. So the only global philosophy that spoke of community was communism and socialism.
Yeah.
Because those are theories. Those aren't, haven't actually been put into practice really efficiently yet.
Right.
But there have been theories based on these ideas or those ideas.
Also, communitarianism is a little more practical and is sort of taking things in a more.
It's
very different,
approach.
right? Because Marxist is very comprehensive and trying to universalize everything in these broad philosophical arguments and this revolutionary science, dialectical materialism. This is as you said, this is about
on each community.
Each community, what do we need?
If your community needs education,
Sure.
Then it's school, it's breakfast programs and libraries. If your community needs food in general, not only breakfast for the kids, but you also need food handouts.
Sure. It's more experience-based and less philosophical.
Exactly. They would see what this community needed the most.
Sure.
If it was political education, they gave them that. If it was practical types of education as far as weapons, self-defense, those type of things, they got that. The Black Panther Party was all about serving the community.
Sure. And that's actually one aspect of their ideas that doesn't get discussed enough, and that I personally have always held that in high regard, because I think that's sometimes the answers or at least the approach is more simple than it needs to. Than you know what I mean? Like, hey, black kids in the hood, they need these basic services. They have these basic needs that need to be fulfilled.
And what the counterintelligence program did was focus on the guns aspect and the self-defense aspect of the Black Panthers to make them seem like they were ominous or a threat to normal society.
Sure.
So that's why the police now, and they use these agents and informants to say, oh, they got a bunch of weapons, or they're fortifying their headquarters. And then the same informants will say, the police are going to break in here, we need to buy some weapons and fortify our headquarters. It's the same agents who are facilitating the weapons, and then the FBI come in and arrest them for those weapons.
And I also think that the way that the Panthers and the other movements in the 70s, a little bit later, after the civil rights era, sort of the main civil rights era had passed, the Nation Time, Jesse Jackson's famous speech, Nation Time. A lot of those movements were reduced to the aesthetics of the 70s. The wearing black, the afros, these sort of stylized forms of resistance, which are totally legit. I mean, I understand this. It's supposed to be part of a larger kind of program, but it's sort of deconstructed. It's taken out of those contexts, and it's turned into, oh, this is just like a stylistic thing, or oh, this is. We talked about this last time we met about. These Back to Africa movements and all that, the way that people still make jokes about it. I saw black comedians making fun of these generational divides. Alice Walker's famous story, Everyday Use, kind of teases about, like the whole, like, I'm going to change my name to Mustafa such and such and such, or it becomes, it's perceived among black Americans often as, oh, this person's going out to find their roots, and it's thought of as it's a little bit goofy, or it's all about symbolism, or about naming that person actually is just doing it as either a fad or as a phase or something like that, and so it isn't taken seriously. Whereas there are people who are, I meet them all the time in Addis Ababa, coming here to really experience that sense of connection, and it's not a joke, it's not a fad to them.
Well, the reality is that the consciousness was raising. If you even look at black history, even recent history, again, from the 60s on, that cultural movement was part of the overall movement. As you say, when it became a thing that was divided, I believe, again, this is my personal and humble opinion, that it was intentional, that some agents were paid to steer it that way.
Right.
And to steer the conversation away from these other areas. And again, they increased the harassment of genuine leaders like Fred Hampton, and I mean, that was straight out assassination, and Huey Newton and Bobby Seale and H. Rap Brown, who actually became a Muslim. I believe his name was Jabir Muhammad. But these leaders, Kwame Ture, who was Stokely Carmichael, they were harassed.
Sure.
They were forced to leave the country, or they were jailed, or they were murdered.
Yeah, Kwame Ture, who was the name is a combination of Sekou Touré and Kwame Nkrumah from Guinea and from
because
Ghana.
Those were two of his
Sure,
his mentors and people he looked up to. So I was blessed to hear him speak a number of times. He came to my college campus, and I went to D.C. one time. And I was active at one point before my Rastafarian consciousness bloomed. I was active in his All African People's Revolutionary Party.
Right.
But, there were different things about that, and again, the Marxist approach and these things that I didn't totally agree with. There were a lot of aspects of it that I agreed with, and it was also in that organization where I saw that many people, took to wearing the African clothes and took names and these things, but it was primarily a statement, because that's what it is a consciousness statement to the rest of your community. It isn't expected to take hold and take root overnight. So these things were consciously done by many to they could see where the movement was going. So they made this conscious choice within themselves that, okay, I'm going to take an African name. I'm going to wear African clothes. I'm going to try to start working with herbs and healing on a more natural plane than depending on the Western medicine and those type of things. So some people took it that direction because for them it was more practical to just deal with yourself and your family. Again, the base, the core of the community is you yourself. You have to be healthy. You have to be of sound mind. You have to be able to formulate plans and affirm goals and work toward them step by step.
Sure, yeah.
So you have to start limiting the influence of drugs in your community and crime in your community in order for your community to thrive.
That raises an important question, as far as your belief in, that some of this was intentional.
All of it was intentional.
Right. You know what I mean, from the government and so on.
Yes, especially from them.
When it comes to drugs, I mean, I had always heard this. I mean, even Dave Chappelle has talked about this on television, that the crack epidemic was an intentional thing, that it came from intelligence services, that to flood these urban neighborhoods with very cheap form of cocaine in the form of crack rock.
It's public record.
Right.
Oliver North,
sure,
who testified in a congressional hearing.
Right, the Iran-Contra affair.
That's what this was. It was all about that. We got opium and cocaine We got that from Afghanistan. We got that from Colombia. And we traded that for cheap weapons that we could boost up the anti-communist movements in these places.
Right. So for people who aren't familiar, right, the Contras, I believe this was in Nicaragua, right-wing anti-communist.
Nicaragua, El Salvador, everywhere, Central America, Southern America.
Sure, well, throughout the South and
other
Central
parts
America,
of the world, even Angola and Mozambique and all of those places, they use that money to finance
hostages, or to
pay for hostages to be
for
released,
hostages,
to pay for guns for the people who are fighting against these freedom fighters. Because who they might say terrorists, but other people say freedom fighters. And then the mercenaries who they hired, the people who lived in that country would say those are the terrorists, but they would call them freedom fighters.
Right, and the Iran-Contra affair is thought of as, I mean, it's the main scourge on the Reagan administration.
Yeah, but again, he wasn't the only president to do that.
And so, but the domestic side of the Iran-Contra affair is what is often left out of when people talk about the history of it, which is seen as, it's a sort of weird Cold War intrigue about, weapons and
money
Iran,
for drugs,
hostages, drugs. But the domestic aspect of it was the 80s is also when not just the Reagan administration, but a number of other people in power were flooding the urban areas with these drugs.
All of a sudden, every urban center was being infiltrated by Colombians who were selling base cocaine to young entrepreneurial black men. And who all they wanted to do was just feed their family, buy some fly gear, and whatever they wanted to do as kids.
And also, who are the Colombians and these other South American drug cartels and whatnot? Those forms of organized crime. Whose territory are they impinging on?
Again,
the Italian Cosa Nostra, right? Like the Italian mafia, which had been there forever, and which had
a lot
been
of times they
make
deals to work with them in order to, because they have their cultural prejudices and biases against the black community. So they were the one. If you watch the Godfather movies,
it's the drugs that kind of and Goodfellas and any others.
They were all flooded into urban centers in order to keep the black population docile.
And there were always ties between government. I mean, this is the latest Scorsese film, The Irishman, talks about this. The ties between the unions, the government, and the Cosa Nostra. It's this very bizarre sort of behind the,
if you listen to Richard Pryor, his stand-up comedy used to touch it, because Richard Pryor, when he first started, he used to work clubs in Cleveland and Youngstown and Detroit that were owned by these dudes. And he was one of the first ones to say they control the entertainment industry.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
And
Sinatra's career.
We learned that from Sam Cooke, because he became a threat, owning all of his own property, and Nat King Cole and all of these, the ones who tried to buck the system and own their own masters, and what happened to them. They were like Ray Charles got hooked on drugs, and all of these people were targeted.
Otis Redding is killed.
Plane suddenly goes down. All of these things happen when they're ready to start their own studio or start their own television station or start their own.
Or in the 90s, Tupac Shakur. It keeps happening. The most loudmouth, the most anti-systemic person, whether they knew what they were talking about or whether they were organized around it, is not the point. The point is just the fact that they had a platform to sort of challenge the powers that be. That is a real threat.
Hoover's directive was to prevent the rise of a messiah that would energize this community. To be able to rise up and take control of their own communities. That was the purpose. And just because papers were found in the 70s that exposed this program, and that they might have moved, and even they made movements. The FBI said, we're going to clean up, we're not going to do that type of thing anymore. But local police took up the agenda. Every local police department formed an anti-drug task force that used the same tactics as the counterintelligence program encouraged. Make divisions between the street gangs and any of those who are trying to get politically correct. If anybody's trying to educate these kids politically, then distract them. One of the things that was used was also hip-hop, because they had those connections in record companies and distribution arms and those things. That's who controlled the So those are the ones who said, don't rap about that stuff. Rap about this stuff.
Right. And especially, that's another way in which the crack epidemic, because in the 90s, a lot of the people who grew up in the crack epidemic, people like Jay-Z and Biggie, that's when they started talking about that experience, and that's when you have the emergence of gangster rap. When originally in the 60s or in the 70s, when it was DJ Kool Herc, who was of Caribbean descent, a Jamaican sort of DJ who brought the same techniques that were used in Jamaican dancehall music to the Bronx. He's really the godfather of hip hop. But then when it became a community movement, it's people like Africa Bambaataa of Zulu Nation who were using hip hop as a peaceful, communal sort of unifying force.
He stopped all the gang
violence
to
get
South
rid of the
Bronx.
gang's violence.
He
and throughout
eliminated
the city.
a lot of that just by saying this movement is all about hip hop. Is just all about having fun, peace, love, unity, and having fun.
And think about how that was perverted in the 90s into gangster rap.
Well, again, I witnessed also that again is still an expression of youths who were crying out, who were describing what was happening in their neighborhood. Even The Message by Grandmaster Flash was predated.
Love that song, yes.
Okay, but he says, he points out that you grow up admiring all the...
Right. Don't push me because I'm close to the edge.
That's who you admire. Those people who have money, who have nice cars, So these are the things that were flooded in our community. That's what young people admire. Oh boy, I want to get money like him. Right. Oh, I want to... And again, I don't blame the youth. I blame the adults who are teaching them these things.
Right. That leads us to an important question. I was going to start off the show with what I usually do, which is, what is something that you've taught yourself? Because you're very much a self-educated person who was very literate at a young age and would like to read and so on. So some of the things that you exposed yourself to, as in the theme of the shows, through self-education, outside of institutional kind of content.
Again, I was saying from before, like the very thing that my first memory is learning how to read. Again, my mother gave me the basics, but the actual interest in reading the written word was something that I don't know why, I just had this extreme interest. I would read everything, magazines, books, and then my mom started to buy, when she saw this reading in me, then, we went to get a library card. And that was one of the first things we did, was go to the library and pick out books.
Sure.
And so just from that early age, being able to go and pick out a book that because something in the cover or something in the title interested me.
Right.
So
and interest is the key to learning.
I always had that is how you learn, is by being interested in it. And
could not agree more.
And sometimes even subjects that I wasn't interested in, but if I just read it, I could retain it. And so it helped me able to take tests, even in subjects that I wasn't that interested in. Like American history, how they taught American history. They left out a lot of things, and they made slavery look like it was just a little hiccup in America's history. Like, we treated black people bad during this time, but now everything's okay. And that's not really the truth of the matter.
Well, I mean, the entire economy was based on the plantation economy and on slave
that's
labor.
That's how America
emerges.
Built the White House, and built the Washington Monument, all of those things that they admire, the Capitol. That was black labor,
but
slave labor.
There's an irony to, and this is one of the reasons for the film 12 Years a Slave, which is about 10 years ago. Brad Pitt and the other people were producing it. They were like, wait, what's going on? This is so bizarre. Hollywood has made a film about everything at this point. I mean, about everything from the life of Gandhi to Mozart and Amadeus to Enemy at the Gates, World War II, and Stalin. Every historical event, except there had never really been a major motion picture. I mean, there had been Roots, television shows. There had been some films, Django Unchained or whatever, that would touch on slavery, but no film in the history of Hollywood, no major motion picture that had ever tackled America's sort of original sin. Which is in itself a perpetuation of that.
That's not true.
Go ahead.
Actually, one of the very first films that was made that was a big hit in America was The Birth of the Nation.
Well, The Birth of the Nation is not really about slavery specifically. It's about the birth of the Klan, right?
Exactly. Right. But the birth of the Klan stemmed from the Reconstruction after the Emancipation Proclamation.
After the Civil War. Right.
And black people started to, because that's a question I get a lot, is that after black people were made free from slavery, how come they didn't do better than they've done? There's other immigrants that come to America and thrive and prosper.
Were they terrorized by their neighbors for decades?
Again, they're not taught that part of the history.
Right.
That's what I'm saying. Birth of a Nation shows you that, even though they show you from a perspective
favorable
that
to the
it's
Klan.
It's favorable
to the Klan.
That's what white
and
people
it's one
like.
of the major films of the early sound
And it's
era.
actually
is Birth of a Nation.
the propaganda
that
made many people feel in America that America was made just for them.
Everyone should see Birth of a Nation. It's an astounding
watch,
film.
but
Horrible
at the
to watch.
time,
Pro-Klan, but
that shows you what America really is.
But I just want to clarify. Birth of a Nation isn't about slavery specifically. It's about the Klan, which is the result of... I mean, the reason they wore what looks like ghosts, white sheets, is they're supposed to be the ghosts of the Confederate soldiers killed in the fight to maintain slavery. And
there's other connections.
So it's really about the Reconstruction era and
it was
the punishment
terrorism. It was terrorism, lynchings, murder, assassination.
As kind of historical revenge for the fact that the South was punished by the North for the Civil War.
Not only that, but black people were forming voting blocks and getting Congress people, mayors,
judges, black senators,
in
the late 1800s, which was still a novelty to people in the early 2000s.
Between 1865, the Emancipation, and 1890, there were almost 9 black people in Congress, 3 senators and 6 representatives,
and judges
there were
at
numerous
every level.
judges and mayors and city council people and people who were looking out for the interests of their community. Or there were whole communities like Black Wall Street, Tulsa, Oklahoma, or then communities all over the U.S. That were black with their own banks or savings and loans and industry.
And for all this talk of progress, 2004, when Barack Obama is elected to the Senate, 4 years before he's elected to the president, he's the only black male in Congress, in the Senate, in the United States Senate, the only one out of 100. Over 100 years of progress since the time when there were significantly more in the late 1800s, right after slavery. It's
and again, I have my own personal opinion about that. I wrote a poem about
Barack Obama.
Actually, it's not about Obama. It's about those people who believed that he would actually bring change. That the poem more addresses that, but the name Barack Obama is prominent in the poem.
So tell us, you don't have to get into the whole thing, but generally, like, your thoughts on this.
The poem goes just like the refrain goes: Barack Obama, Barack Osama. Get in touch with yourself. Have a talk with your mama. I am a repatriated African who won't be fooled, won't be ruled by plantation politics. I ain't surprised because I can see the house in their eyes, running for the prize. But what they fail to realize is that the system that they serve is foundationally compromised, built on crime. Now it's judgment time. Historical grime cannot be erased by Mr. Clean or any other household product, if you know what I mean. And it goes on like that.
You performed that in 2009, didn't you?
I performed that
in
for
many bars and clubs. I remember. I've seen you before. So we only met a little less than a year ago.
I put it to music and
there was a band, right?
Back in the
day.
I
remember seeing somebody. I didn't realize it was you
and
until now. Performed that song in 2009, shortly after Obama was elected, and I was dating an Ethiopian American woman. Who was so disgusted by what you were saying that she got up and left because she felt very strongly about the Obama thing. Now, she was a black woman who had grown up in the white suburbs. And listen, I was around a lot of white liberals in college in California on that night in November 2008, and the whole thing smelled funny to me. The whole thing smelled like this is denial. This is another effort at denial. And denial is the key to perpetuation of any kind of injustice. I mean, in the days of slavery, slave owners used to write letters, private letters, because they were racked with guilt. We were talking about, well, these heathens from Africa, if they wanted to leave, they would have left on their own volition. Well, maybe it's because if you had caught them, you would have cut off their limbs, and also they would also be, even if they do make it to the north, they're completely cut off from their families. That might have something to do with it. But no, these heathens from Africa, we're actually doing them a favor, and so even slave owners used to deny racism during slavery. And in the 1960s, there are Gallup polls showing that the majority of the white population, including liberals, including Democrats who were pro-civil rights, believed that there was no such thing as racism, that black people have the same rights as white people. In the 1950s and 60s, the majority of the white population. So my question to anybody who wants to deny the existence of racism and use Barack Obama or any other tactic is, what are the chances that the people who were wrong the whole time, because we would all acknowledge, I think even the most racist white person would acknowledge that there was racism during slavery and during the Jim Crow South. What are the chances that the people who were wrong this whole time are suddenly right and the people who were right this whole time are suddenly wrong. Right?
Well, again, we've always said, the Rastafarian community, that the world has been upside down for a long time. That things that are foundationally correct are placed on the bottom, and things that are intrinsically evil are the things that are encouraged and supported. For instance, when Wall Street was on this tear and this greed, that was the way money was made in the 80s, was to be greedy and to raid pension plans and to invest in all of these quick money making things. And these people were doing a lot of cocaine and buying a lot of expensive cars and suits and fur coats and these things like that. And then the bottom dropped out, and poor people lost their houses.
Right.
Poor people lost working people lost pension for when they retired.
And if they were to go to do drugs because they were surrounded by crack, their penalties for doing crack, for doing the same drugs,
they got 25 life. If they had
100 times worse than the penalties for
or even just a felony because they didn't pay pocket tickets in time,
Sure.
and so they got a felony conviction for even. If they had any of these things on their record, they would get the maximum sentence
Sure.
for just trying to juggle a few cocaine rocks to make some money to feed their family.
100 times the penalties
For
that people who are the politicians themselves or their children or the Wall Street people that you were talking about would get for doing the exact same, consuming the exact same drug.
They would pay the lawyers lots of money, and they would get the case.
And in the legislation itself,
because they had those avenues,
right? And there were different
or they
punishments
would pay off judges, or they would pay off people on the jury, or they would do those things to corrupt the system.
Or the legislators themselves, since they were part of these same circles,
sometimes were corrupted themselves. Would
pass laws that were 100 times. Where the enforcement was 100 times worse against people for doing crack rock, for smoking crack, than for snorting cocaine, even though it's the same drug.
Said years later that law that he signed into the maximum the maximum sentence legislation that he authored,
94 crime bill.
Yes, that was not fair to black people.
Who authored that bill though?
No, but then again,
it was Joe Biden, the current president of the United States.
He had a lot of advisors and a lot of people behind him. Again, it's not one person who was able to get that done. So it was a systemic idea that they had been talking for a long time. It's code words. When they say law and order, they mean control those black people.
Absolutely, yeah. And the law and order vote had been a Republican thing for a long time, but Democrats were always accused of being soft on crime and so on. And they felt, especially in the Clinton era, that they had black people in their pockets, right? Because the Clintons and the other top white Democrats had been going to churches, black churches, and doing the dance and being friendly and seeming comfortable. And Toni Morrison, the great Nobel Prize winner, famously said Bill Clinton is the first African-American president because he had a single mother and he grew up in poverty in the South, et cetera, et cetera.
We say that for different reasons.
Oh, why do you say that?
We say that because Bill Clinton got his thing done in the White House, in the office. You know what I'm saying?
Well, so did Kennedy and so did
other
white people. But yeah, I got what you're saying.
You know what I'm saying? Yeah. That's why we said, he's the first one, because he did things that black people would do on the job.
Right.
Not really stick to the principles or morals of the job. Because that's an old joke in black.
Sure, you're making it as a joke, but you see what I'm saying.
It's a joke.
Yeah.
That's what it is. It's a joke because actually the first person who should be considered as America's first African American president was Frederick Douglass.
How so?
Frederick Douglass was the one who advised Abraham Lincoln to sign that Emancipation Proclamation because he didn't have that intention to do that. Yeah. If it wasn't for Frederick Douglass, a lot of the consciousness about the wrongness of what slavery does to people, because he was an escaped slave who taught himself to read and who forged letters from his master to set himself free. And then he kicked his master's ass before he left. And his master was his father too.
Right.
So he beat his ass, left, got on a ship, went to England. And then he became an author and a speaker against slavery. Changed his name from the slave name he had to Frederick Douglass. Wrote a book, Up From Slavery.
It's a great book. So I highly recommend it to anybody.
And he shows you what slavery was like, especially for an outspoken, a young black man who taught himself to read, so he had sense, he was literate. So he would often trick some of the white people when he was young, when he was learning how to read. Bet y'all don't know what this say. What does this say? Can you read this? You know what I'm saying? And they would read it, and he would retain it, and then he'd go and study it later. Things like that. He taught himself to read. He had a young slave woman little girl who was his, she kept him as a possession. So she taught him to read innocently. But, when they found this nigga can read, they separated that, they made that friendship end. And they beat him severely, and they put him out in the field because he was a young houseboy, because he was the son of the master.
Sure.
But again, you have to read the book.
It's a great book.
So Frederick Douglass was actually,
book,
during that time, he was the first write-in candidate for president as a black man. And he didn't get enough votes to win, but he was written on the ballot. Like, people wrote him in. And then years later, he formed his own party, Peace and Freedom Party, and did run for president.
Right, which still was fielding candidates. I voted for a Peace and Freedom candidate in 2004. It was Landon Peltier, the Native American. The one who was framed by the FBI.
So Frederick Douglass was the one who started that whole consciousness in America that's many, again, because there are some whites who really and truly repent and regret any part that their family or that their ancestors took part in slavery. And they worked tirelessly to end slavery in England and in America. So I don't like people to think that we're anti-white. We're not anti-white people. We're anti-oppression.
Yeah, or anti-black.
Or anybody who's anti. That's what we're
and I think part of the problem is that people have this perception, white people run the world. And white people have privilege. Like, the term white privilege is itself misleading. It's not wrong, it's misleading. Because it's not that white people are on the whole privileged. It's that privileged people, like the super privileged people, billionaires who run the world, are almost entirely white. And nobody even talks about it. For instance, and we can transition to talking about football now, the American football. But this is a good example, right? Is that for years, and I'm a big fan of football. You played for many years.
Just in high school I did, but I learned a lot from my own personal experiences about the process. To me, it began to appear like it was just a gladiator sport. It was like something that
from the Romans, right?
Yeah, and then
mass sports comes from the Romans.
It continued in, like you say, the film Django.
Yeah,
it shows you how they put two black bucks and they make them fight to the death.
Right. You say that football and slavery have a lot of the same.
It's in the same. It fulfills some of the same
desires
in people.
I mean, the way they measure the athletes, and they're this and they're that before deciding whether or not to select them in the draft.
My friend, I have a very good friend, Coach Carlos. He used to play for the 49ers.
Sure.
And he described his experience to me. And he said himself, that's how he felt, like he was on an auction block.
Yeah,
and he's only in his jock strap, and they looking at the size of his testicles, and they looking at and they check their teeth, and they check. It's just like, it's really like
dehumanizing.
But this is to get to be a first round draft pick.
Right.
That's how they feel.
A lot of money.
And you got to run the 40. You got to run. You got to
do all the drills.
You got to do all the different drills, and you got to impress the people who are watching.
And the majority of the people, especially the most accomplished people there, are black, and almost entirely the executives
who are watching and
white,
who are measuring
and who are selecting.
So it really brought that home to me, just to see that. And even though I was injured, because like a lot of young black people, we think professional sports is our way out of the ghetto.
It is.
And so we
sports and entertainment
tirelessly for that. But I grew up in a town where it was, football, not far from the Football Hall of Fame in Canton, Ohio. Like where I grew up was like not far from where LeBron James grew up, and not far from Cleveland Browns, and there was football all over, high school, college. So
upper Midwest for people who
you really feel like that's what you have to do. That's what everybody does. Your uncles, your cousins, everybody plays. And then your uncles, and some of them, some of them have ankle or knee injuries that they don't play anymore. Now they work in the factory, or they worked in the factory, they retired, they're on benefits from the government because
memory problems and from concussions and head injuries,
or straight up gone.
Yeah.
In a home or a mental institution because of, the residual effects, the PTSD.
Sure, I mean, Junior Seau, Aaron Hernandez in recent years, suicides and murders and so on. That has to do with CTE is what they say is the result of.
And then when you combine that with that was during the same time as the Vietnam War. So some of them came straight out of high school and were drafted in the...
Right. Into the same word, draft, that is used for selection into a professional sports is used as selection into the military. Isn't that crazy? We don't even point that out.
It's very similar. We look at it as the same thing. That's why in the 60s when they were saying burn your draft card, it was such a big deal.
Right.
And it was professional athletes who spoke out against those who were protesting the war. Even when Muhammad Ali refused selective service, it was professional athletes like Joe Louis and Jackie Robinson who came out and spoke against him. Oh, he should be more thankful to the country to give him such a nice job, and he's making so much money in the U.S., so he should be just thankful to serve in the... And he was saying, no, I don't have that perspective. Again, young black people in the 60s had this perspective that, no, the U.S. is not doing anything for me and my community. The Viet Cong is not calling me nigger. And dehumanizing my community. It's these people here. So if it's anywhere I'm going to fight, I'll fight right here. Right. So that scared a lot of America, and so they had to. Oh, you got to speak against that. They pressured some of the black heroes from the previous generation because they're used to when the white man says do this, you have to do it.
Right. And one sort of racial controversy involving. The NFL recently, and Al Sharpton and Jesse Jackson, I think, were involved in this, is that, for many years, there were no black quarterbacks. Right? Very, very few at the NFL level, right? Because quarterback, which is the highest paid in the leadership position and the sort of the prima donna of the team, the guy who passes the ball.
They used to say we couldn't do it. They used to say
because you're right. It requires intelligence and it requires leadership.
The qualities.
Right. Lack the intellectual qualities and the character qualities. And then gradually, like even when I was a kid, it was only a few, but it was the McNabbs and McNair. And
every time they did.
And then they were really good. They were really good also because, I hate to say it, but often black men do tend to be a little bit faster, a little bit more athletic, and so they added that dimension to the quarterback position, which today is taken for granted, that the quarterback also has to be able to run and not just throw the ball. Right. So suddenly now, if you look at the last 5-10 years, with maybe one or two exceptions, I think Josh Allen out of Buffalo, Carson Wentz maybe, but almost all the good ones, the really successful ones, who have been drafted the last 10 years are black or biracial.
Cam Newton,
But here's the thing, Cam Newton, Kyler Murray recently, right? It goes on and on, Lamar, and so on and on. Mahomes.
I get you.
Right. So then here's the weird thing, though. Quarterback's not the main leadership position in a football franchise. Above him, there's the head coach. And the head coaches, to this day, I think there's like 4 or 5 black or Latino head coaches out of 32.
Again.
Out of 32. One of them, by the way, last week just left or was fired from the Miami Dolphins. Brian Flores is his name. This was just a few days ago. Yeah. Brian Flores is incredibly successful. Brian Flores is the only guy who could consistently beat Bill Belichick, who was the greatest coach of all time in his division. And he's a young guy, black guy, but because of some kind of dispute with ownership or something, it's not very clear what happened, but it's a little bit like, who does this black guy think he is, making decisions in our, or at least that's the way a lot of people read it. So beyond though, the head coach is not the most significant leadership position in an NFL franchise. Beyond that, there's the executives. There was one. Now I think there may be 2, but there was one for a long time, and it was the guy at the Ravens, Ozzie Newsome, who had also been a player before then, and he was terrific. Yeah, he was at Baltimore, I think. Maybe he played.
Well, it was Cleveland Browns, but then Cleveland packed up one night and went to Baltimore, became the Ravens.
The Ravens, right, because the Baltimore Colts went to Indianapolis.
Exactly.
Right, so regardless, the executives. There's even fewer, and the ones that are there are very successful, but there's even fewer. And then finally, and this is the part nobody talks about, when we talk about white privilege, right? Like the most privileged people, the billionaire class, the owners of NFL franchises are billionaires. Almost all of them inherited that wealth. At no point has a black or biracial or Latino person even come close to owning an NFL franchise. Maybe Oprah. Right, that's pretty much it. Right, so those are all very strange. So the fact that we don't talk about it, and that the focus is on the lower levels of leadership, and that everybody takes for granted. Well, of course, they're no owners.
They'd rather focus on Colin Kaepernick is kneeling during the national anthem.
What is your take on that? Because I think our audience probably is familiar with Colin Kaepernick. I was a 49er fan during that time, so to me, Kaepernick was the quarterback of my team before he became, Rosa Parks or whatever. But what are your thoughts on it?
Again, he took a stand when he didn't have to, because, again, his stand-up comedy is really, they said some of the succinct lines, but they say he was light enough that he didn't have to. He didn't probably get some of the treatment that some of the darker blacks got.
Because Colin is biracial, right?
Yeah. So, but at the same time, I think it was Dave Chappelle, he said he took a knee for us. He took a knee on how black people were being treated. He himself probably wasn't being treated that way, but he probably experienced it growing up once or twice. I think that's in his biography that was made on HBO or something like that, or ESPN.
Yeah, because he was adopted as a child. He was raised in a white family, mostly in the Midwest and in California.
He wanted to play baseball.
Yeah, he was a pitcher.
He was pretty good, and he was actually more interested in that than even playing football.
Yeah,
but he saw that the racism was more prevalent in baseball than it is in football.
It's still strange to me to see a black baseball player. It happens, but it's strange. Or a hockey player for that matter.
And again, and when you want to go to the manager and the owner level of those sports, it's even more.
Oh yeah.
Worse than American football.
They literally call the system where they raise you up. You know what they call that? The system where, because you don't normally in baseball, it's different from other sports, where you don't go straight from high school or college into the pros.
You go to the farm.
The farm system. Yeah. They call it the farm system.
No,
they literally go to the plantation.
Who was a pitching prospect in Ohio, where I grew up, and when he was like 15, 16, he had professional scouts coming to look at him.
Yeah.
And they were planning on
like he can't get right or something,
and put him in the farm system for one of these pro teams. And I think his mom said, no, we're going to let him graduate high school first, and we're going to see about college before we do any of that. But they were there sniffing around. And when he was like 16, they were there in the town. They would come to his games, because when he was in high school, he had like this record of no-hit innings, like over 30 innings he had pitched.
Right.
And in high school, you can't pitch more than 6 innings at a time.
Right.
Because they want to preserve
your arm. Yeah.
Yeah, and then they can't. It's a rotation. Pitchers have to be in a rotation, so you can't pitch every game.
Sure. I mean, throwing no hitters is like almost impossible.
He had
baseball, so he's very good.
30 home no-hit innings that he had pitched. So he had scouts from all over the place.
What ended up happening to him? Did he play?
No, he got killed in Youngstown, Ohio, in a whole nother street business. So.
How many stories are there like that? But it's so interesting, though. I mean, high school. I mean, you played high school sports, right? In certain places, and this is hard for people anywhere other than the United States to wrap their minds around, because school is school. High school, college. This is why I didn't play in high school, because I had just come to the States from Africa, and I was like, why would I play sports in school? I'm here to go to school. Like, I didn't understand. But school is school, and then maybe later on you go into a professional athlete and you have like a normal professional career. But in America, especially places like Texas or Florida, they're filling up stadiums of 40,000, 50,000, 60,000 people to go see 15-year-olds beat the crap out of each other.
Ohio.
Right. Ohio, too.
Pennsylvania.
Yeah.
Michigan.
Yeah.
Indiana.
Nebraska, Idaho.
All
the more
those
rural states, especially where there's nothing else to do. And where the sports arena is the second or third largest town in the state on Saturday or something.
And the community, again, like this is a thing that you learn and you understand. When you're not playing sports, you're nobody. But if you're on the local team,
now you're somebody.
And you do good. You're somebody whose picture's in the paper, or whose name is announced, who makes a good tackle in the game, or who does something doesn't have to be extraordinary. It has to be just good to help the team.
Right.
Then when you're in town, strangers say hi to you.
Right.
They talk to you.
I had that in college
strangers.
Just because people thought from looking at me, because of my belt, they were like, "You're one of the football players?" And I'm like, "No." Oh, okay. but like they approached me just on the possibility that I might be one of the.
And some places we could go, we could get a free slice of pizza.
Yeah,
some places we could go
make my day
because it's the one of the boosters or one of the. Right. And there were places that we could go and we could get free stuff.
Right. Imagine having that at 15, 16, and then the entire town is following you, like the whole slave owner experience. They're following you throughout your high school life, your college career, your professional life. But I see you walk with a cane. You were talking about injuries to your knees and all these devastating sort of the after effects of being placed in that position. Yeah, was out of necessity.
I'm not bitter because it helped me. It taught me because I had to pursue another line of approach. I had to look at something. Pro sports was not in the cards for me anymore. So
and you had self-educated effectively as a young kid, literacy.
I felt like that I could take tests. I could get into university on my academic. I didn't have to depend on the football.
Right.
And that was important for me at that time because I had no clue as to what I wanted to do because I had invested so much time and effort and thought and prayer into this football dream that when that was no longer feasible, I had no clue what I wanted to do. Right. Not a clue.
Imagine how many people there are, black and white, who their apex is being in high school and wanting to play football and having that dream. The dream doesn't get realized. Some of them will go into the corporate world and will still have that social power of people wanting to be their friend because they played in high school, college. But a lot of stories of people who, like the apex of their experience of this world is when they were 16, 17 years old because they could throw an accurate out route. That's all they'll ever be. Yeah?
You have to be one of those people that were very successful to have that measure of success. Most of the people that I grew up with, again, I've been blessed because I have people who did achieve that level of success, but also some who, like me, were hurt in high school or college, and they did not have the academic to back them up, so they had to return back to the hometown and work in the factory.
Right. It's a rough fall from grace, yeah. And no fault of their own.
No, it's not their fault, but it's just because, again, some of the stars of the team were coddled. They weren't pressured to. People would help them with their schoolwork. They would, tutor them for free or do their tests for them or, these things took place. A lot of people don't like to admit it, but these things took place. In some universities, there's whole systems that make sure the football player passes and gets his degree, even if he's never been in a class. Right. And it happens, and it's been happening and because they're focused on once I get into the league, there's the payday. Right. I'm buying my mama a house.
But until then, they're exploited, right? Because the NCAA is basically a giant cartel, right? Which now they're being forced to pay the players to some extent, and gradually we're moving in that direction. But like especially football and basketball, there are states, Mississippi, Alabama, that would have no public universities if it wasn't for college, for football, right? Like these so many people are making so much money. They're making a killing off of these laborers, and they're unpaid. So that's another way in which it is slavery.
The television revenue alone. They rake in so much money just from the game being on TV.
Right.
That
it's the biggest business in the state.
So that's why they're now, and again, it's a long overdue process. But now they're trying to get the players, and just like the Olympians, they can finally utilize professional players because that's what the world has been doing the whole time. They just sequester and they pay them and they make sure they can eat and they have a car and they can do all the things they need to do. But your job is to do the very best in this sport for this country.
Think about video games. Like NCAA, college football is a video game, right? So somebody can use your likeness and your name as the basis for a video game caricature of who you are, without paying you or even without even having to ask your permission. I mean that is a level of control, right? But everybody kind of just
when you sign a contract for the team made sure that's in the fine print.
You're signing a non-professional contract. You're signing an academic contract, a contract to attend that school for scholarship, right?
Yeah, but again, once you submit yourself to that football program, the football program can use you and your likeness in any way it sees fit.
Right.
If they want to put you on the billboard because you're the star and it brings tickets into the arena, they can do that, and they don't have to acknowledge you or pay you.
They can do whatever they want except one thing: pay you.
Yeah,
They can do whatever they want to you. They can demand whatever they want to you.
and for
They can
years,
never pay you.
That's what the
They're not allowed to.
boosters and they would do it under the table.
Sure,
They would
sure.
make sure because they want to keep these players happy.
Right.
So the corruption is endemic to the system.
Sure. And it's a reflection of a society, and again, neither of us hate America
It's
or anything like that.
hypocritical.
But it's a reflection of a society that's based on a system of race and different kind of power structures
It's
that go back to
hypocritical.
the original sin of slavery. And you're right, there's so many parallels, and I want to get Coach Carlos in here one of these days to talk more about this. But I want to hear about that experience of feeling like he's on the auction block, because it is so prevalent in the society. This glamorization of the athlete, but the dehumanization inherent in
They
that
call it the
glamorization.
combine.
Combine, yeah.
Even a
the
couple years
draft.
ago, or a few years ago, LeBron James, when he started becoming vocal about things, and sportscaster, newscaster, I don't know what she was exactly, but she comes on the air and she says, LeBron, shut up and dribble.
Shut up and dribble, right. That was a conservative woman.
And I'm
Fox
saying,
News,
and that's, in the 2000s, this is like recent history.
yeah.
This is the attitude that a lot of people have, is that your job is to just entertain us in sports.
Right.
And you're not to think, you're not to express yourself, especially about things that make us uncomfortable.
I remember two controversies similar when it came to the NFL. Right. So in the NBA, the players have a little bit more power. Right. A little bit more power. There's more free agency and so on. A little bit more. But in football, the union is terrible. Whereas the union in baseball runs the league, right? The player union really can do whatever they want. They get guaranteed contracts and all that. The unions in football have no power for whatever reason, right? And so two things that I remember happening that were very controversial involving race. One is, you remember Warren Sapp? You remember that guy?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, Warren Sapp was one of the best defensive players. He came out and called Taliabu, the commissioner of the NFL, he called him a slave owner. So like, this guy treats us the way a slave owner does. And of course, the black people in the media all kind of defended Warren Sapp. Well, hey, listen, you don't understand what he means by it in this defensive way. Like, hey, like we go through a certain thing. And the white sportscasters were like, how could you say that? Come on, you guys are getting paid millions of dollars, right? And so that's still kind of operating in the background. I mean, Warren Sapp is probably worth $100 million. And for him to use that language of slavery, it's like, it's offensive in a way, both to slaves and to white people. And in another way, it sounds just about right. And then, Donovan Mcnabb, you remember him?
Yeah.
The quarterback for the Philadelphia Eagles. There was this guy, Rush Limbaugh, who died recently, who was the head of the conservative movement in radio.
Well,
he was on.
He was
remember
a
that?
large voice. Yeah, he
Yeah.
wasn't the head of anything, but he just.
Right, well, I mean,
he just
was
launched
the-
himself to the top of-
unofficially.
yeah,
Yeah.
okay, we
The
can
head,
say
he
that.
was the most listened to voice in conservative
That we can
America
say.
because of radio. Right, that's what I meant. Sort of the unofficial, especially when Obama came into power, he was like the unofficial head of conservatism in America through radio. He had been on ESPN as like a commentator. I have no idea what they had Rush Limbaugh on there for. They were really asking for it. And he said something about Donovan McNabb. There was this whole debate, is Donovan McNabb overrated? And it had to do with his athleticism or his performance on the field. And he went on there and he was like, there are these special forces. I'm doing an impression of Rush Limbaugh. But there are these special forces at play, behind the scenes, blah, 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 blah. And he meant that, because Donovan McNabb is black, that's what makes him overrated, is that people want to see a black guy succeed at quarterback even though he's not worthy of that, right? And of course, eventually, they didn't say anything at the time, but eventually he got kicked off ESPN and so on. But the fact that those little controversies would every so often remind you that, sports is supposed to be fun, entertainment, but there are all these parallels to this deeply, deeply racialized society.
Even, again, I used to like Howard Cosell. I still like Howard Cosell. I mean, he was one of the more colorful announcers. Mm-hmm. He had a unique cadence in the way he talked.
Yeah.
Was so, and one of the things, he was very sympathetic to Muhammad Ali's cause.
Yep.
One of the few sportscasters who were sympathetic and who acknowledged that this man has a right to his viewpoint.
A Jewish guy and a black Muslim.
Yeah, but years later, he was on Monday Night Football, and one black player is running down the sideline, and he's a kickoff, so he's on his way to a 90+ yard run, and Howard just says, "Look at that monkey go."
Howard said that?
Yeah, Howard said that. Look at that little monkey. Look at that little monkey run, and it wasn't done in a
Right. He just blurted out the wrong thing.
And he took a lot of, and they got rid of him after that because, politically correct, you can't say that.
No.
But they didn't take into consideration the type of person Howard Cosell was before, and and again he was getting kind of old, so but that's how white people talk about black people in private.
For sure.
And he just exposed that. So I don't think Howard should have been demonized for that. He should have been reprimanded like he was.
Right. Possibly have a conversation. When somebody says something like what Rush Limbaugh said, or instead of coming down on them and then creating this sort of forbidden fruit feel for white racism, every time we tell the truth
under the table.
Sure, and then you get Donald Trump. Right, then you get people being like, "This is the guy who's telling the truth."
And then they say code words.
Yeah, code words, passive aggressive behavior. Instead, how about every time a controversial that happens, everybody gets a chance to kind of spill out their guts and say how they really feel, and then maybe you learn and you move on. But that's not the American way when it comes to racial.
America is not going to do that. America has to face too much, and I don't think they're really ready. Even, like I said, South Africa did that.
Right.
A lot of places have done that because that's what's necessary to prevent a bloodbath.
You're talking about Truth and Reconciliation?
Yeah.
Yeah,
sit down and talk about what you did and how you participated in the system. Whether it helps or heals that's another debate.
Yeah, but, I mean, I think it's an important to point to address really quickly, is that I agree with the sentiment of Truth and Reconciliation, but in effect what it was white guys coming on there with sarcastic smiles being like, yeah, so what, I did all these crimes, and then going back and living in their mansions and just handing over political power to one small group of the 90% of black South Africans who were kind of bought off themselves and who had the same class interests as the white person.
But the principle, and that's what I'm saying, that those things need to happen on a more community level, not on a whole countrywide level, because if it has to take place there, then it's too late.
Yeah.
But it did prevent a bloodbath because one of the major slogans up until that time was one settler, one bullet.
Yeah.
And if that would have been the policy that would have prevailed after the liberation of South Africa, then everybody would still be condemning South Africa to this day.
That's a very fair point.
Again, and it's like what they did to Haiti.
Sure.
Haiti was the first free black country.
They could have allowed
the French out.
They could have allowed the and I mean 200 years later when there's the earthquake in Haiti, Pat Robertson is on TV going, "This is the punishment that black people in Haiti get for not knowing their place 200 years ago and having a slave rebellion."
All that, or for practicing voodoo and not being good Christians, or all these different things were said about. But again, that's why I love Marcus Garvey's quote where he says, "Look for me in the whirlwind," so that every time that there's a cyclone or a hurricane and it wipes out the tiki torch whites in the trailer parks and the Ku Klux Klan, I say that's Marcus Garvey. That's not just your average hurricane or storm.
It's similar to the Tom Joad line in The Grapes of Wrath, repeated in the Bruce Springsteen song, and done by Rage Against the Machine. Wherever you see a cop eating a guy, wherever a hungry newborn baby cries, look in the eyes going, "You'll see me," right? It's that same sense of like the same rebellion is sort of brewing.
It's still going on. Nothing has changed. That's why I say I equate the 60s counterintelligence program to what was happening, the division that was being created in hip hop in the 90s that resulted in the deaths of Tupac and Biggie, who were potential leaders outside of hip hop.
Sure.
So I connect all of those things to even some of the apathy in the community about Africa and about global Pan-Africanism and those type of things, because it's been targeted and it's been steered that way on purpose. They don't want us to have that link together. They don't support those of us who leave America and come here.
Right.
I don't get any money from the U.S. government to live here. You know what I'm saying? They'd rather not even acknowledge that a person like me exists. Somebody who's not happy with America, who left America because America went to war against black people in the 60s and is still continuing. No, I'm not a fan.
But at the same time, I recognize there are benefits you can gain if you go there and get education, or if you get some money and then you come back to Africa and invest that money. To me, that's a win-win.
That's a win-win. That's sort of my own personal dream.
But you can't go in there and expect to. Well, I mean, you can, again, because you have that right and that option. I just would disagree. If you go there and become a true blue American and you adopt those American principles and you believe you can do that.
I personally chose not to, but no, I don't think there's anything wrong with it either.
But
that's a personal choice.
At the same time, again, I could not, fundamentally, I disagree. Yeah. And if you ask me the reasons why, I'll give them to you. But I'm not going to sugarcoat it for anybody.
We appreciate you not sugarcoating it and coming on and
I have another poem.
Go ahead, please.
I spell America with 3 Ks. The land of the free, the home of the brave. Nah, more like land of the lion, home of the slave. See, we didn't land on Plymouth Rock. That rock landed on us. And it took a long time before we were able to have a semblance of human rights, not to even mention sit in the seat of our choice on a bus. And you want to say that we're all equal because the last presidential face looked like us. So that it goes on in that frame. So.
I like it.
So. I mean, I felt free to write about my experiences once I left America. I didn't feel free to write about some of these. I wrote some of these things, but I didn't perform a lot of the poems that I wrote that mentioned the counterintelligence program and mentioned all of these things, because to me, that would be like putting an X on my back. Right. So I waited till I got to Ethiopia before I started writing pieces like that.
Did you have any influences in the spoken poetry world or in the
black
literary world?
Yeah. Like I said, Langston Hughes was one of the first ones that I started to read, and I could hear him. Right. You understand what I'm saying? When I read his poetry and his stories, I could hear him.
His voice. I agree. I feel the same way about Langston.
And so that's what I would look for when I would read different poems and poets from that era. And then another one who spoke to me that way was a group called the Last Poets out of New York.
I'm not familiar.
Yeah, you gotta check them out. Google them. Check them on
YouTube. Do you know Gil Scott Heron's work?
Gil Scott Heron is another one that
Gil Scott
also
Heron
spoke to me.
Oof.
And Amiri Baraka. His name was Leroy Jones, but he changed it to Amiri Baraka. Yeah. And he also, because of the way he would incorporate jazz into the rhythmic delivery of his poems. Right. And a group in the West Coast called the Watts Prophets were also instrumental. When I would hear these poets speak with the rhythm, sometimes with the African drum behind them, sometimes with the saxophone.
Or Gil Scott Heron would do that with the drum.
Sometimes just with the raw, naked voice. Yeah. It would just hit my ear in such a way that I felt like, I could do that. I could write and express myself like that. I just have to overcome my stage fright, my fear of being in front of people and talking. I had to overcome that before I became confident in that the words I put down, I can also deliver them in a rhythmic and coherent sense that people would say, oh, wow, that's good. Or you spoke to me, or I could hear what you were saying in that piece. I just want to do what those poets did for me. Right.
I think Ralph Ellison is another good example of somebody, the book Invisible Man, who in his prose style, you can tell, without being like a literary critic or anything, you can tell that he's imitating the syncopations and the riffs of jazz music.
Oh yeah,
in the prose,
again,
as did Richard
Wright. Ralph Ellison was in that era, so he would go to those jazz clubs. He listened to Bird, he listened to Train, he listened to them cats. He heard them, so he knew where they were coming from, and that was part of the fabric of their society.
I highly recommend Invisible Man.
Just like hip-hop is the fabric of our society. Absolutely. Also, and I don't want to leave out female writers, because one of my teachers was Nikki Giovanni.
I'm not familiar.
Nikki Giovanni and Sonia Sanchez are two very dynamic women poets who also in the 60s were doing the spoken word, the thing. And even Gwendolyn Brooks, Brooks was a published poet who was loved by white people. But then in the 60s, she grew her afro and started writing about what was happening to the young kids in the street.
I've been to her talks.
I went to one in college too.
Yeah, in college.
She was amazing.
Yeah, she's fantastic.
Because she was open to new ideas. She was not one of those people from that generation that said, you have to do it like us. She said, I want to listen to you all.
I'm going to hear how you're doing it. You know what I'm saying? That she grew her afro, and she wasn't no young chick, but at that time she identified with the young people. I thought that was so brave, and it cost her some of her book deals and things like that. She had to go to black publishers in Chicago to publish some of her later works because of her stance. And I'm going to wear African clothes. I'm going to wear my afro. Oh, some of the white people, because they were patrons of hers before. Oh, we don't want you to do that.
It sounds a little bit like Richard Pryor's career. You mentioned Richard Pryor earlier on. Richard Pryor was imitating the sort of respectability politics of someone like Bill Cosby for a long time, doing like sort of household comedy.
Richard Pryor started out doing just in the suit and tie.
And he was really good at it, but that wasn't him. It was only later when he joined the counterculture. Same with George Carlin, that he became a completely different kind of figure.
Yeah, well, it became more of like, you have to speak your truth.
Right.
You have to speak the whole truth and nothing but the truth in order to be free inside.
Right. We should mention Alice Walker, since we were talking about female writers. Alice Walker wrote Meridian, and I love the story. If people like short stories better, Everyday Use, which sort of deals with a lot of the same topics that we addressed today: generational, educational, the sort of Back to Africa movement,
the contrast between generations.
Absolutely.
And also because every generation, young people don't agree with their parents.
Yeah.
That's always been the case, because the kids who were listening to bebop in the 40s and 50s were going against the swing music of their parents.
Sure.
And the people who were doing the R&B were going against the bebop and the jazz of their parents. And the people who were doing hip-hop were going against the old school R&B of their parents.
And every generation thinks of the newer generation's music as noise.
It
sounds like noise. And nobody can escape the old trite cliche of the kids these days. Right. The kids these days is
even when you say to yourself, I'm not going to be like that when I get old.
You're setting yourself up
exactly the same way. I again, my favorite music, and I'm not afraid and ashamed to say it, is music from the 70s and 80s that I grew up listening to. I still listen to that music to this day.
See, I like that stuff too, and I was born in '86 and was raised in the '90s. But as a child, I often felt I had more of a connection with my parents' music and with the classic rock of the '60s and '70s, and with some of the black music from Chuck Berry to B.B. King to Louis Armstrong. My dad gave me an interest in that. In being in Ethiopia, had that connection to Black American music. I pretty much mourned Chuck Berry, my dad and I, when he passed away a couple years ago. We should also mention Alice Walker rediscovered a woman named Zora Neale Hurston, who we were talking about.
She was one of my favorite writers, again, because of her controversial things they said about her sexuality, whatever. And so even among black people, they'd hardly talk about her before. But now, same with James Baldwin.
I was about to say.
James Baldwin was
a
tenured professor on my campus when I was in college. And so I used to go and listen to his lectures.
Really?
Just because that dude was history. You know what I'm saying? And I just, I'm not going to focus on any other part of him.
Sure.
Or, you know what I'm saying? But this dude, you got to listen to this dude, because he's been there and he knows that. He was there.
Absolutely brilliant.
King and Malcolm X, and he was at their funerals and shit, man.
And he wrote The Fire Next Time, which is one of the best manifestos from that era.
He wrote a lot of great books. You know what I'm saying? He was, and not only just as a writer, again, just as a speaker about what black people were feeling at that time. Because you had a lot of black people who were apologists for white people, or, they would speak against their own community. Oh, well, we don't agree with these people in the street burning things down and looting because that's damaging our cause. No, he didn't say things like that. He was like, this is an expression of their anger.
Sure.
You're going to get more of that if you don't address these things. That's what's happening. It's not, you can't blame these children, these youths, for how they're reacting to oppression.
No more water the fire next time. It's using the Bible, biblical verse.
He's saying you're gonna, that's what the Bible says. Water this time, but the next time is the fire. All of those things are things that we, as black people, we take those things to heart. Even if we don't go to church, we still have that biblical foundation.
Absolutely. And you talked about, at the beginning of this whole conversation, you said something I wanted to go back to, which is how everything is kind of upside down. We live in this upside down world. The line, from the Ghost of Tom Joad as well as the Old Testament, right? The last shall be first and the first shall be last. There is a sense of that. The meek shall inherit the earth. What a revolutionary figure the Christ figure really was, and how strange it is that he's co-opted to the opposite ends of these sort of anti-imperialist pacifists.
That's what they do with every revolutionary.
Every single time.
Once they're dead, they can't speak for themselves.
Exactly. Yeah.
But the thing that we understand, again, this is the Rasta consciousness thing, is that the Christ consciousness exists on earth. It's not something that's on a wall and in a picture. It's not something, because he was not killed 2,000 years ago. He was crucified. It was what they call capital punishment by the state. But the spirit and his ideas still live. And people still express his spirit and his ideas of the meek shall inherit the earth. The power is inside of us. And in unity there's strength. You know, he said a lot of things that are revolutionary politics. That's, again, why he was singled out and murdered.
Sure. Yeah.
Again, if it had been in the U.S. in the 60s, he would have went to the electric chair.
Yeah.
If it was today, lethal injection. Then it was pound with nails to a cross.
Right.
All right? So it's capital punishment. We have to understand that. And the state was enacting capital punishment. And his community, which should have protected him, but he was uncomfortable to them. Talking about the Jewish leaders at the time, the Pharisees and the Sadducees and the people whose authority was being questioned by the roots people in the street. So yeah, we can get rid of him and let the Romans do it, and then blood is off our hands. We'll let the Romans do it, but they cooperated with the Romans. So we understand that religious leaders co-opt movements and work with the governments to silence voices of resistance. We understand that. That's why Rastafari has been painted as, they'll listen to reggae, grow their hair long, smoke a lot of weefer. That's who they are. They're not good for anything. They're not going to give you anything. Sure. Or even some will say, as far as they're blasphemous.
Sure.
They're preaching against Jesus. We're not.
Well, the same things ironically were said about Christianity in its early days by the Romans, right? Like, they're cannibals because they're eating the blood and blood. They're gay and they're into incest because they talk about loving their brother, and they're a bunch of anti-imperial, hippies walking around preaching all kinds of anti-Roman stuff.
Jewish hierarchy,
that last part might have been true.
The Jewish hierarchy objected to his going in the temple and saying, "You've turned the house of my father into a den of thieves."
Right, and they blamed the Christians
were taking the money for the meat that had to be sold and sacrificed, or the birds, or the cows, or the sheep and stuff. That was the business that was at hand, and they were in charge of that. So they didn't want that to end.
Right, and they blamed the Christians for the burning of the temple in 70 AD, which is why the Book of Matthew is so anti-Jewish. Is that both communities blamed each other for the Romans burning their temple in 87, specifically going back to that.
Historically, again, if you even go back further, again, the things that Christ did that pointed at not only the Romans but at the Jewish hierarchy at the same time.
Absolutely.
They were all in the same boat. That was the thing that he pointed. He pointed out that they were all oppressing the poor people.
Right.
And using religion and using the law of the state to keep people in line.
Sure.
And he was saying that that's not what God intended for the people made in his image and likeness. That we're all supposed to reflect that God's spirit. But as long as the clergy is telling you that you can't do it, you have to pay me or come to my service and get a little bit of it from me. That's how you get the spirit. You have to go through my intercession, and you have to pray to this one, or that one, or this picture on the wall, or that person who's related to him, which has nothing to do with what he spoke and what he taught. And then, again, how we, the Rastafarians, pointed Haile Selassie, and they say, but he himself said he was saved by the blood of Christ. Haile Selassie pointed all Rastafarians to come to the Orthodox Church and learn about the history of Ethiopia.
Haile Selassie pointed all the Rastafarians that direction. That's why you see so many Rastas who come and the first thing they do is go to St. Gorgie's Church or the Trinity Church. First thing they do. Or many of us, like myself included, were baptized in America at Ethiopian Orthodox churches. And we have our Ethiopian name. So this is not a new thing for us. And just like they criticized Christ and his followers in that time, we understand they're going to criticize us who follow Haile Selassie's example.
Correct.
Because that's his example. His example was to speak out against oppression and injustice on a worldwide scale. Now, again, I understand that some people say, oh, but here in Ethiopia, he didn't do this or he didn't do enough of that. But he had appointed ministers and people in those positions and delegated to do things here that weren't done. Because, again, the system itself and some of the people's heart was corrupted. They don't want to do the right thing. They want to line their pockets. That's true as in his time, as today, as the 2,000 years ago. There's always people in those positions. Some people want to teach the people and uplift them, and some people just want to line their pockets.
Right.
So, again, that's nothing new.
Nothing new under the sun. Well, thank you so much for coming on. We
No
really
problem.
appreciate having you on, and please come by anytime.
Okay.
You're a good friend of the show, and I always learn so much from hearing you talk about your experiences as well as everything you've come across in doing your pursuit of self-education, apparently from a young age.
Yeah, I've been blessed. Again, like I had, in my formal education, I had a teacher in the 4th grade, it was from 1966 or so, who was very pro-black and conscious. So she made it her business to teach us about Marcus Garvey and Malcolm X and things that we wouldn't have normally got in our curriculum. She did that. Mrs. Daniels, I'll never forget her for that. And then my 5th grade teacher was another black woman, because 4th, 5th, and 6th grade, the school I went to was predominantly black. And we had tracks. So the better students were in 1st track, the average students were in 2nd track, and the poor students who needed remedial help were in 3rd track. And they used to divide us in our minds and say, 3rd track kids are dummies, and the 2nd, you know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
Like your goal was to be in the 1st track class.
Sure.
And I always saw that as that's a subtle way, and Miss Daniels pointed it out too. She would say, we have to serve the rest of the school. We have to teach the other kids. We have to do that because the school is not going to do that.
Sure, and it's good because it creates leaders, student leaders, right? Because you learn from
that was
teaching
her
others
attitude.
and
Yeah,
from
so
reading others.
when in '66 it was Negro History Week. It wasn't Black History Month. But we took the whole month to organize a Negro History Week program. So in 1966, she was revolutionizing our minds and showing us, look, y'all need to be on this, not just 1 week in February. We're going to start from the 1st day of February, and then during the last week, we're going to present a program to the whole school about what we've been learning all February. It's for Negro History Week. But she didn't limit it to the week. Every day we were on some black stuff. Every day. So that whole month of February was enlightening for me, that it's connected to the rest of my life. Like, I never forgot some of the things she taught me.
Right.
And so I don't just condemn formal education, but at the same time, the interest, like you said, if you aren't interested in learning things. I was in college. My first year, I took a class in African American Studies. And the professor of that class was a Vietnam vet. This is like 1978, 77, 78, okay. My first year in college. 2nd year in college, actually, but my first year at Bowling Green. And he was a Vietnam vet. He only had these 3 fingers on this hand, and only 2 fingers on this hand. Like, he had handled alive something and saved a bunch of his people, but he got his fingers blown off. And he used to pop aspirins and smoke cigarettes, like chain smoke cigarettes. As one was burning out, he'd set it on the end, light another one with that, and continue. Like, he
in
never
the classroom,
stopped.
right?
Yeah, never stopped smoking
used to do
cigarettes.
that.
He just lined them up. But he had so much information. Like, he was one of the first ones to take it back to the Olduvai Gorge and the Rift Valley. Like, that was the first time I heard any of that argument, that the very foundation of mankind has been found archaeologically
in Africa.
In Africa, yeah.
Yeah, I learned that in 1978. Like nobody ever taught us that until this class. So I was like, wow, and I was really into the class. And when he asked questions, I would raise my hand and I would answer and stuff. But I noticed a lot of the other people in the class was not. You know, they would just sit there and take notes. And if you talk to them later, I just took the black class because I should get at least a C. It's a black class.
Right.
Like they didn't put any effort or interest to what he was teaching. They were just in it because it was the black class. And I marvel at the apathy of my own. These are in my generation. These are my peers.
Sure.
And I was like, wow, really? That's how y'all think? This is like real. This is history. So when I wrote my paper, like I really put myself into it. And of course I got an A in the class, but a lot of people, they just are satisfied with the C, or they just did the minimum amount of work.
I had the same experience in the 2000s, both as a high school student and then teacher at that same high school. Was, first of all, there was tracking, which I think we talked about this yesterday. On the show yesterday, the existence of tracking. The honor students versus the college prep students, the standard students, and so on. Eventually, they got rid of standard, because they felt that was like becoming like an insult, like standard. That's the dumb kids, right? So they made it CP, was college prep. That's our because it was a college prep student. And then I remember the black kids saying jokingly, and it was you laugh really uncomfortably about it. It was really upsetting. They say CP, the CP stands for, they go, colored people, right? Like the black kids are from the hood. They're there on scholarship. They're there to play sports and to allow the school to feel that it's fulfilling its Catholic social justice mission. And the leaders, who really benefit from having those black kids to build themselves up, and because when you lead and when you teach, you learn the most, are these white privileged kids from the suburbs. And those divisions were there well into, and the apathy that you described is there well into the 2000s and the 2010s.
Yeah, well,
probably there today.
Even part of the agenda too was that they created a class of people, especially black people, the ones who were educated. They really focused that, okay, once you're educated, you aren't the same as those street people. You're different now. You are educated, so therefore now they want to put you on a different pedestal.
Right.
And again, the rewards are more for if you stick in this direction instead of going in that direction. If you speak more eloquently,
sure,
and you don't use street slang,
sure,
then you'll be promoted faster. So a lot of black people, it created a class, an assimilation class, basically.
Sure,
that,
sure.
This is how you get along in America. You just assimilate and you become part of the American
sure.
system.
Yeah, I subconsciously, because I was a kid at the time, I didn't understand any of these things. I knew that this argument was in the culture, but I thought it was actually kind of an offensive argument, that like being eloquent or being educated or whatever is like white. Like why should that be? Like we're just accepting this narrative ourselves. To me, that was the residue of colonialism, that we had accepted it. And I was always like, well, I'm Ethiopian. I'm not from a colonized people. I grew up in Africa. I know my history, and I know their history better than they do, right? So I would confront white teachers about some of the stuff that they would say about their history. That school that I was talking about were Irish. It was Irish American. Mm-hmm. And anytime they would try, I remember I'll tell you this story. You'll like this. There's a gentleman who I later came into conflict with because he was my boss. Years later, as the head of the faculty, he and I were already clashing. There was mutual respect there. I was a former football player, Irish American guy, when he was my teacher. We were reading theology, the Old Testament, and he asked, "Where's the Queen of Sheba from?" And I naively thought that this was not controversial. I raised my hand and said, "Ethiopia." And he goes, "Ethiopia? What are you talking about? She's from Yemen." The whole classroom erupts in laughter. And that was the moment where I saw the facade drop on all these white kids. Like the viciousness of their laughter. At the thought of, later when I told the friend, he was like, what did they probably imagined a monkey with a crown on her head. But the guy started insulting me repeatedly afterward, because I quietly put in his mailbox a whole bunch of printed documents about why I said the Queen of Sheba was from Ethiopia. But the guy had it out for me at that point of like, and I realized only later on that it was out of insecurity, because I had seen probably 10 times of the world that he had, even though I was 1/3 his age, and he was supposed to be my teacher. And I understood Irish history, and that they were colonial subjects in Ethiopia weren't, up until the Irish until the 1920s. I had read James Joyce, right? And it was just full of ironies, right? That experience, but It was sort of, some people call this placism, right? The Jamie Foxx character in that Oliver Stone movie about football. He said, it's not racism, it's placism, right? You don't have anything against me as long as I know my place, right? Usually that's more the southern sort of hard-headed, the southern wolf as opposed to the northern fox, because the northern fox wants you to do well, but wants no interaction with you. Right, so those TV shows set in New Haven and Connecticut and all that on the WB, black people are great, but we just don't have any interactions with them because we're uncomfortable with them. We support them ideologically. We support the civil rights movement. We support them, but we have no meaningful. We don't. Yeah, exactly. Whereas the Southern wolf is the opposite. The more conservative, the quote unquote these are stereotypes now, but trailer trash and all that. They want you to be their friend. They want black friends, right? They want to be allied with you. They relate to you. They share an experience with you, but they don't want you to do better than them, right? They do not want you to do better. That's why they'll keep voting Republican. This was this interesting kind of.
America's full of those interesting dynamics. Like across the board, there's different points of view. But one of the things you have to understand it wasn't even until like the late 1700s. Where color became a distinction in America, because there was, like you said, some of the Irish came to America as slaves, as
indentured service.
But they had a period of time.
Right.
However, it was 7 years or 12 years or whatever it was.
Or to fight in the Civil War on the side of the North, because they were experiencing the potato famine that wiped out half their population.
Some of them came just for that.
For the Conscription Act. I mean, they'd end up in the army and then they'd get citizenship.
Exactly. So that type of thing was what incentivized some of them. And then so some of them now were in America, and when black people got their emancipation, they suddenly felt threatened. Because, again, these people now were in a position to be either equal or superior to them.
Sure.
So many of them took this attitude like, okay, we can't be seen mixing with this community.
Absolutely.
But before that, many of the slaves, like, again, if you're in a slave community, black and white, would come together and form families and have children and that type of thing. Like that happened. Sure. But then there were philosophers and people who started writing that we have to preserve the white race. We can't keep mixing with, that's a crime and a sin. Because if we do that, then the white race will be wiped out. Because, again, simple genetics will show you. And they were seeing it on the plantations. You're getting a lot more of these half and half kids because the master and the overseers is going to the slave.
Right.
And so the children that are
Thomas
born,
Jefferson used to do that. More than Sally Hemings.
Again, but you can imagine that was just a very because he was president and because people were, and he was rich.
Right.
So he had a lot of slaves.
Sure. He was a great architect as well as a great writer. So he was a million things before he became president.
But all of this whole society felt like, even like I said, I've heard here in Ethiopia, some people say that God forgives you what you do to a Saratania.
Yeah.
It's that attitude that if you're
right, they're not really human.
That they are there to serve you. That's what they're there for. And if you have a person like that in your household, after a while, you take it for granted that that's what they're
sure.
not.
The class divisions in Ethiopia are so massive and so upfront that they're
to fulfill your will.
Sure.
Not to express their own destiny.
Do you think there's a difference here too between class relations in the United States and socioeconomic divisions in that the United States, and I think this is true of like Kenya and certain even societies in Africa, if you live in the suburbs, like that school I was telling you about, there were students who came from the wrong side of the tracks, black kids from the hood and whatnot. But you could live there for 20, 30 years and never experience what was going on 10 minutes down the street across 280 highway, where the black people and poor Latinos and whatnot, and poor white people were living, right? Everybody kind of lives in their own little socioeconomic enclave, right, in their own little American dream
Yeah,
world.
but that's what America is designed to do.
Right. It's designed in the material-built culture, the highway system, the way the societies are built. It is designed to keep people from being conscious, to being even aware
You go to
of
work,
these differences. Whereas in Ethiopia,
home,
that is not the case, right?
You take care of your yard.
Yeah.
There's a role for you to play.
You have to get in your car to go down to the store. You don't have any meaningful interactions with your neighbors. I thought American suburbia was like a fate worse than death. Like, especially for young people, for young black people, it was just like, why on earth would I want to live in this kind of? But for a lot of older people, it was sort of the reward.
Safe.
Yeah, it's safe. It's a
It's
sign of your affluence.
They
it's
own their
comfort.
own house.
Sure.
Their yard looks nice.
Sure.
That's again, those are things. Those are status symbols in America, and these things were imposed upon us because prior to World War II, people didn't care about freshly manicured lawns and that type of thing. That was an invention that came after the
Right, they didn't
World War
exist.
II.
Right.
Of course, but once it became something, this is something you need to focus on, not inner city oppression and poor people, and you don't. That's
Well, you
not
can't
your-
focus on something you're not even aware of.
Again,
you're not even conscious of.
You go to work and you come home, you go to work, and then if the only way that community touches you is if you get mugged, if you go into town and somebody robs you, or then now all of a sudden your encounter with that community is in a criminal aspect. So now you view that whole community as what? Criminal.
And the fact that all the conversations we were having about history, this is where it gets to be relevant. Because you said yourself, you said it very well, like, people are not aware. They're not taught certain aspects of this history. And so they think, why did you mention this earlier? Why can't black people, the immigrants did, why can't black people were terrorized and so on and dealt with all kinds of, a racist power structure for years. No, why can't black people make it, stop with the excuses? Okay, aside from whether or not these excuses exist, Barack Obama said it himself. He mentioned Obama. He said, no more excuses. Right? Yeah, on some level you could rely on excuses, or what this does is actually perpetuates racist beliefs even more.
Of course.
The belief that these are excuses is the problem, right? Not the excuses, but the belief that these are excuses and those same old denials.
Because again, I don't say they're excuses. Some of them are reasons and facts.
Right.
Is part of history.
Some of them are history, right?
Yeah, that's what it is.
Some of it
It's
is
history.
right?
Some of it is documented. Like I said, now you can go to the congressional record and see what Ollie North said about the cocaine. You can go to some of these historical, again, even though they're entertainment, it's fiction like The Godfather and Goodfellas, you can see what happened in America during the 40s and the 50s.
And also there's this revulsion against solidarity among certain people. Native Americans, black people identifying themselves as my people went through this, or then and that. It's laughed at. It's like, well, what is this? This is racial. This is tribalism. But they don't have that same attitude when you talk about the glories of the forefathers, or about the different European communities that came over here, the Irish that we mentioned over there. Oh, that's normal. You're supposed to take pride in your heritage. Yeah. You're supposed to take pride in your heritage. You're supposed to take pride in us being one nation. Nationalism is perfectly fine as long as it comes from
and again,
certain
if you watch the Gangs of New York, or like in Fargo, the Fargo series that was on, you see that every one of these communities had their own organized crime.
Sure. Yeah, and in the upper Midwest, it's the Scandinavian.
Everybody had their organized crime. Like, again, there was Jewish gangs, there was Italian gangs, there was Irish gangs, there was every community had there was Greek gangs. In every community they have their organized crime.
Sure, they're Cosa Nostra. Right?
Services,
our house.
Vice. It services the vice in the community, whatever it's prostitution, it's gambling, it's any illegal substance. Or goods, hot goods that are cheaper if you buy them from these people than if you buy them at the retail store. All of these things have always existed in every community since the beginning of time. This is not recent. These are all things that have been, especially in America. Again, like, America doesn't like to admit its own criminal past. They try to throw out these ideals that these slave-owning founding fathers wrote down on a piece of paper. And so they revere that piece of paper, the Declaration of Independence and the Bill of Rights and all of these things that they wrote for themselves, excluding black people and women at that time when they wrote these words.
Sure, women get the right to vote in the 1920s.
So all of these
Well,
things that we hold these truths to be self-evident,
That all
all
men-
men are created equal and endowed with certain inalienable rights. And then the Bill of Rights shows you we have
Written by a
rights.
slave owner, the Declaration of Independence,
Yeah.
or the line you just read.
It's
Endowed by their creator with certain.
Yeah, he probably quoted it, but he had
self-evidence. Yeah.
he had an assistant writing. He didn't write himself, probably.
Right. Ben Franklin was one
He
of
had
his
too-
major
he had too many
editors,
people.
and
He
John
had-
Adams. So.
He had too many sessions with Sally to be doing all that
Sure,
writing.
sure.
Anyway, so that's a reality too.
Well, I think we should wrap up.
Okay.
So thanks so much again for
I
coming
can get
on.
on my soapbox.
Oh, so can I. So can I. Dueling soapboxes.
I appreciate
We do
it.
a podcast, just the two of us. We could call it Dueling Soapboxes or something. Something of that nature.
Yeah, it's just soapbox session.
A soapbox session.
That's what Marcus Garvey and them cats used to do back in the days. They used to just set up in the park and start talking.
Do they literally use soapboxes?
Yeah.
Okay, that's where that term comes from.
That's where it
It's
comes
just a
from.
real
That's on my
thing.
soapbox.
Right, it's like when you find out the chip on your shoulder, like literally people used to place a chip on a shoulder when they were upset about something, and I'm going to put my chip on my shoulder.
Oh, yeah, or
so these
even-
expressions are literal.
That was a thing too. Like somebody would put it on in our black neighborhood. Somebody put something on his shoulder and then dare the other person knock it off, because that was like, okay, that's the invitation to fight.
Right.
Yeah. So that
Right.
all the-
I mean, in Shakespeare, Romeo and Juliet, it's biting the thumb. Remember that? It's such a bizarre thing when they teach you that. When you read that play, it's like, oh yes, if you're mad at somebody, you would bite your thumb at them. That's how you do that. So. Regardless, thanks
yeah,
again
even
for
in Italy, I mean, the
Yeah.
Italian, they still use that as a.
biting the thumb.
Yeah, they don't actually put the thumb in their mouth, but
Really?
yeah, they still do that.
The biting the thumb thing from Shakespeare is still going on.
It's from Verona, from them
Verona,
times back in the
yeah.
day. It's from Italian times back in. Because that's an old story. Shakespeare just adapted an old Italian
Yeah,
story
sure.
and wrote a play about it. Shakespeare didn't write that many. He wrote some sonnets and some poems, but those plays were things that he adapted from.
Well, I mean, the source material is
Yeah,
out there, right?
yeah,
But the
that's
writing
what I'm saying.
itself
He's a
is
story.
yeah.
The translation to English.
Sure. Or
That
you
was
would
the
use
thing he
history.
did.
I mean, Julius Caesar,
Exactly.
Henry Richard III.
Exactly.
Henry.
Or what was the Shylock?
Oh, Merchant of Venice.
Merchant of Venice.
Yeah, Merchant of Venice.
Things like that. You know, he would like point out these stories about the Jewish community in Italy at that time.
Well, you know, so I'm writing a chapter about this in the book that I'm working on right now, right? Which is Othello, the Moor, and the similarities. So I wanted to write a chapter on the similarities between that and the experience with Obama in 2008 and how recurring it is. Because everything is very 2008 November in the first act of that play, and then they go to war with the Turks, Turkish Venetian Wars, and suddenly you have this descent into hell because everything is kumbaya, and Shakespeare understood this as a white guy in the 1600s in England. Everything is kumbaya until a conflict comes in and introduces the possibility of dissent, envy. So that play really ends up being about envy and jealousy and paranoia.
It's all
and,
Iago couldn't stand the fact that his superior and then the husband of this beautiful woman was this black dude.
Right.
That-
Desdemona and
that-
Cassio. And
that irked him.
Sure. It did, and also he was passed over for a
Promotion,
promotion, by Cassio. So you're familiar with the story. But there's also there are a handful of really interesting black archetypical characters in Shakespeare. There's Aaron the Moor from his first play, Titus Andronicus, which is about the feud between this Roman general and the Queen of the Goths, who's married to the Roman emperor. And Aaron the Moor is, like an over-sexualized, angry black man. And then you have Othello, who's the sort of the dignified figure who was brought down by the jealousies of those because he's isolated at the top. And it was, according to Venetian law, you had to be a foreigner, visibly a foreigner, to be the head of the army, because Venice was a city-state run by civilian leadership, and they didn't want the army. They wanted to put a lid on the army to avoid any military coup or anything like that.
Right. They didn't want families to take over.
Sure.
Yeah. No, I understand.
Sure.
I understand.
And so that's why they brought in a foreigner.
But again,
as a
this
lid.
is history. That's the point too. That black people were part of the fabric of history. There was not this white supremacy doctrine in that time.
Sure. Not at all.
What that developed, again, like I said, with apologists for slavery, because the slave trade started when they started taking Africans wholesale from the continent in the 1600s.
Right.
Late 1500s, 1600s.
Which is right when Shakespeare is writing.
So
it's right when Shakespeare's writing. Is that
when these white supremacists screeds started to come out. It was like it's from 1760, just prior to the independence of America.
Right.
That's when these ideas of manifest destiny and that white people were created and that these people were created to serve, and that and preachers started to use that scripture about the curse on Ham to justify
the son of Noah. Right?
Yes. So these things were used, but they didn't begin to be utilized until that time. That was not the prior interpretation of any of those scriptures.
Sure.
But again, they decided, okay, we're going to use this to bolster that argument. And so then now you get an understanding of churches were very segregated.
Sure.
Black people went to black church, white people went to white. So what's disseminated in the church is what people begin to believe. A lot of people were not literate and read the Bible themselves. They only believe in what the minister says is in the Bible.
Sure. And let me add a third Shakespearean character, black character. Have you ever read The Tempest?
Yes.
Shakespeare's last. Do you remember Caliban? The relationship between Caliban and Pryor. So the Tempest is about. Tempest means a storm.
Right.
A storm comes and there's a shipwreck.
Right.
With these Italian guys onto this island, and then there's this character Caliban, who I think is like half the son of a nymph tree or something. Anyway, but he's black.
Yeah.
He's a native black person to that island,
Okay.
who becomes like a slave or like a colonized subject to prosper. This is before colonialism. That Shakespeare anticipates this, right? Because certain people are so brilliant as writers and understand the human condition so well that they can anticipate certain aspects of history, like the pound of flesh at the end of Merchant of Venice, when Shylock goes, "I want my pound of flesh. I want my pound of flesh." That's the 20th century. That's what ends up happening to the Jews in the 20th century, and a lot of the feeling of the need to either get revenge or protect yourself from it ever happening again, right? But the same thing, Caliban has this relationship with Prospero, and he says to Prospero, his Italian colonizer, he says the lines that are known as Caliban's paradigm, and it's used in post-colonial studies. Again, post-colonial study, after colonialism, when Shakespeare's writing before colonialism, right? And he says to him, "You taught me language, and my profit on it is I learned how to curse." It's this perfect little way of establishing what the relationship between master and man, between colonizer and subject is. You taught me language, and my profit on all this stuff with education, with language, with civilization, the civilizing mission. Right, it's the profit that the subject gets on that is they're so downtrodden and they're so historically victimized that the real profit of the master providing those tools is to use those tools as a vehicle for rebellion.
Yeah, well, even that theme comes out in Robinson Crusoe.
True. Yeah, I didn't know the
And
fuck.
also, again, Frederick Douglass reiterates that theme too, because when I learned to read, I realized I was a slave. And I could not accept that condition. So from that time, he was thinking, okay, I need to get out of here. I need to get away from this. But it wasn't until he was educated and he understood by reading that I'm in a subservient position here, and I shouldn't be. He realized it again. He says it, I think, in his autobiography, that my learning to read, I realized I was a slave just by learning to read. And Harriet Tubman famously said that she saved a certain amount of slaves, but she would have saved more if they'd have realized they were slaves. She would have saved more people if they would have even realized they were slaves, because a lot of people were happy in their existence. That's, again, this Django showed you that too. The character that Samuel L. Jackson played, Stephen, the head of the house. Django was a threat to his position. He didn't like him from the first time he said, "Who is this nigga on the horse?" He didn't like him right from the beginning.
Right.
Who is this nigga on the horse? He's up above me, and I'm the main nigga in this house.
Right. This is the sort of the Uncle Tom
He
field
was
overseer, house nigga character. Yeah.
So I mean, he was the perfect illustration of that. That this dude came here to this house and he threatened my position. I don't like him, and I gotta find out what he's really here for.
Right.
And everything he did from that point, even how he had put
Jamie Foxx's wife in the hot box before, and they had intrigued. Oh, you got a slave that speaks German, and I'm German, so I want to meet this slave. So the first thing he asked was, "Where's that girl that speaks German?" Oh, we had to put her in the hot box. She tried to run the other day.
But have you noticed? So there's the Sam Jackson suspicion, the Uncle Tom suspicious of the black person, the other black character, the Jamie Foxx, who is not sufficiently sort of
he's not
acceptant
subservient
of his,
at all.
acceptant of his position, right? But then there's also the opposite suspicion, and I know because I've experienced both of these dynamics in the United States, right? Like any black man has. The opposite suspicion that I dealt with is being suspected of being the Sam Jackson character, of being the Uncle Tom, because of the way I speak, or because of the fact that I had white friends, or because I grew up in the suburbs, none of which are things that I'm ashamed of, or nor should anybody be ashamed of. But there is a suspicion from the guy who thinks of himself as the Jamie Foxx character, and I deal with that here. I mean, I have family members who look white, but they're half caste, they're mixed with European blood or whatever, and we'll be together, and some of the waiters or some of the other service staff or some of the places we go, they'll straight up be like, "What are you doing with this white guy? What's your problem? Like, why are you being like a house nigga?" Just by virtue of me being in their company, I'd be like, "Oh, you don't understand. This is my first cousin. These are my blood relatives. Your perception of this situation, your suspicions, you can go project them onto somebody else. I don't even know you, right? But you understand what I mean? Where there's this odd sort of cross suspicion that goes on. Are you the Uncle Tom? Are you the Fields nigga? Are you the this?
I blame, because again, it's not that cut and dried. It's not that simple, and because you have to understand, you see Stephen's position, how old he was, how long he had been in that position. He was Mr. Candy's.
Talking about Sam Jackson?
Yeah, okay. Sam Jackson's character in that movie.
Right.
He had grew up in that house. The young boy, Leonardo DiCaprio's character, his father before him had Sam Jackson's character in that position. So Sam Jackson understood, like he's a very good actor. See, he understood this dude had years of this position in this house. And just seeing that black dude on a horse ride up, threaten his
What's the nigga doing on a horse? It was what they're all saying. Yeah.
What is that? No, he wouldn't even pay attention. The dude kept saying, "I need to talk to you. You ain't even glad to see me, and all you going on about is this nigga on the horse. This is my guest."
Right.
He couldn't accept that.
Right.
Why? That's what you have to understand. So it's the conditioning of black people's mind over years.
Sure, and riding a horse, it has echoes of a certain kind of class ambition or a certain kind of uppityness.
Black
like literally,
people
you're
were not
elevated.
allowed to ride on a horse.
Even here, right? Even here, like there's a certain in the feudal relations in Ethiopia. Being up on a horse, walking around riding on a horse means you were upper class, and so on. You were able to learn how to ride, or you were taught.
You control the beast.
Right, you control the beast, and you're literally in a position of elevation. So if somebody placed you on that pedestal, probably as a result of your inherited position of superiority within feudal.
Again, like I said, Jamie Foxx's character, he had to be free to ride that horse. He had to, and he was a free dude who worked for white people, selling and judging, fighting niggas. That was the act, because his whole purpose was to go find his wife. That was his purpose, but he took on this role, and he played that role perfectly. Like he was harder on the slaves then, because that's how black people in authority were in those times too. Black people who had some authority would exert that authority over those slaves. Another example is Candy's mistress, who was in the room when the two black dudes were fighting, and she was just sitting at the drinking wine and in her nice dress and everything. She wasn't watching the fight, but she was allowed to be in the room. That was her elevated position above all of the other slaves in the house.
Correct.
Because she was Candy's mistress.
Right.
So she had an elevated position above the serving girls and above the girls in the field.
Right. Well, I'll go into this because this is again the subject of the book that I'm working on right now. Is because I mentioned the Irish and I mentioned James Joyce, right? James Joyce, I don't know how familiar people are in our audience, but he has these two sort of basic character archetypes. One is him, right? The intellectual guy. He went off and lived in exile in Paris. He was very uppity, very ambitious. And then there's the average Irishman. So there's Daedalus, and then there's Leopold Bloom, who's Jewish actually, but who, in spite of that, and Irish is a very Catholic society, sees him as lower middle class. His wife is having sex with another man throughout that day with the character. He's got nothing. He's dispossessed. He's nobody. But the key moment in Ulysses is when he's asked, "Where are you from?" And he goes, without hesitation, he goes, "Ireland." And that's who I am. And so he represents the life of instinct, whereas these other characters, life of intellect. The woman who taught me this is a woman named Evan Boland, who I found out passed away. I found this out like last year. But she had been my professor at Stanford, and she had taught 20th century Irish literature, and was a very famous Irish poet on her own, in her own merit, and so somebody I had great affection for. So that was her take on Joyce, which is very different from most people, the way we were taught Joyce in high school and in college, because everybody reads Joyce in America, right? In high school and college, the way we were taught is that he looks down on his people for having this self-defeating attitude, for having accepted what their master tells them. But really, it brings up the question: who has accepted? Who is it who has accepted? Is it the uppity character, or is it the guy who sort of knows his place and who practices sort of the life of instinct and is sort of comfortable in who he is, but who he is sort of a downtrodden figure. And so I relate this to the most popular sitcom of our youth, of my youth, that launched the most famous black actor which is Will Smith and The Fresh Prince of Bel-Air, right? The relationship between Carlton Banks and Will Smith, the cousin character. Carlton Banks is used as a term of disparagement, as an insult, in the same way that Uncle Tom is, in the same way that the term in Joyce is West Britain. Like, you're trying to be like the western region of Britain, which is where the Irish are. You're trying to be like one of them, right? Because Britain is not a unitary state. But if it was, Ireland would simply be West Britain, under the guidance of English culture, right? And then I go to examples in India. I go to examples. Assimilé is the term that they use in West Africa, an assimilated person, right? They would say this about Léopold Sédar Senghor, the first president of the country. I grew up in Senegal, who was actually a poet and a man of letters and a member of the Académie Française, and a grammarian in French who married a white woman and went and retired in France. But at the same time, if it hadn't been for him pulling a George Washington and creating a precedent where leaders retire rather than become king, maybe Senegal wouldn't be this great example of democracy in that region. That's completely different from everybody else in that region. Part of that is owed to the guy who accepted the Western standard, because the Western standard was peaceful transition, and people retire, and you allow for the next election and the next guy up, right? So there is this sort of question always, like Carlton or Will, right? Daedalus or Bloom, Stephen Daedalus.
I understand, and again, I think that's more of the controlling agencies' aim to divide and conquer, because really both are being used by the overall system. Both Carlton and Will.
Correct.
Both.
That's a great way to put it.
Yeah, no, so...
It's a great way to put it. Yeah, they're both being used.
Pitting them against each other is just what? Because then that way it will perpetuate itself.
So then the question becomes, how do you escape that dynamic? And my argument, while looking at all these examples, is exactly, both ways have their... It's not that either way is impossible. You still live. But both ways lead back to subjugation. So my question is, at what point do we internalize and start reproducing that powerlessness? And is that not that dynamic, that whole rise up or stay down, Icarus or Daedalus? Is that dynamic not what, in my mind, that's what over the course of generations in all these different contexts keeps certain groups of people. The same thing can be said about women. We talked about feminism and Christina Hoff Sommers' argument yesterday in comparison to John McWhorter's recent book, Woke Racism, which is the same dynamics in the context of race, right? But you see what I'm saying, right? Like, this is what keeps certain groups of people in certain positions over others, is this creation of like a catch-22. Right, damned if you do. In fact, the title of the book is Black 22, right? So it's exactly what you just said. Both of them lead down the same road.
Yeah, no, they're victims of the same machination.
Correct.
Again, it's the divide and conquer. There was some people say it's fictional, some people say it's real, but there's the letter from a slave owner, Willie Lynch, a slave owner from Barbados, and some of the plantation holders in the Carolinas in that area. They wrote to Willie Lynch because they wanted to know, how is it that you keep, you're on an island where you're outnumbered by blacks compared to the whites that are there, and yet you've got the slave population under control. So how do you do that? Because we're becoming outnumbered here, and we need some policies or some institution in order to control this population, or otherwise they're going to overrun us, and one day they're going to rise up against us. And so the Willie Lynch letter lays out the strategy of, well, the first thing you do is you take the biggest, strongest, most threatening looking black man, and you gather all of the women and children together, and men and women and children, and then you take this black man and you tie 4 ropes to his limbs, and you try each of those ropes to horses running in the different directions, and you just pull them apart in front of everybody, or some other brutally illustrative way that, look, if you talk back, if you plan any insurrection, if you even stand up looking like you might want to do something, this is what's going to happen to you. So mothers would teach their children, keep your eyes down, keep your head down.
Sure.
Say, yes,
sure. It's like bodily terror. Terrorizing creating a deterrent of.
And then once you do
Kunta
that,
Kinte having his
so you once you do that, then you pit the old against the young, the men against the women, the light skin against the black skin.
Right. Divide and rule. Right. It's the oldest.
Once you begin that system, they themselves will perpetuate it, and you don't have to do anything after that. You just sit back, and because that seems to be a characteristic of black people.
Sure. Are you familiar with Michel Foucault's work at all? Foucault? So Foucault, in his early work, so later on he got kind of weird and becomes kind of difficult to understand, but he's a very important social theorist, still to this day. And he has these books, his early books are called Madness and Civilization and Discipline and Punish.
Okay, yeah.
Discipline and Punish is probably his most famous, where he talks about an example of this in Europe. Mm-hmm. It starts off with a regicide, this guy who killed the king, I think Louis Philippe or something like that. Guy kills the king, and he's drawn and quartered. Exactly as an example of what you just say. You mess with the king, especially you try to kill the king, right? You best not miss. That's what they say in The Wire, right? Come with the king, you best not miss, right? Because this is what's going to happen. You're going to become part of a spectacle of violence. Then, this is the medieval way. Then we have the Enlightenment, we have liberalism, and people don't do that anymore. We're too civilized for that because that was the savagery of the past. And he goes, no. Michel Foucault goes, no. What they've done is they've moved the apparatus of control, the means of controlling and coercing and from violence, bodily, literal violence that is inescapable and also undeniable.
Now they threaten your livelihood.
Well, there's that. That's a good point. But even more so, one of the ways they threaten your livelihood is the prison system. Discipline and Punishment is about the prison system, and Madness and Civilization is about the mental health system. And these are apparatuses of control where it's about the liberal concept of rehabilitation. Right, so rehabilitation sounds nice and flowery, like a lot of liberalism, like civilizing mission. So it's these benign veilings that are placed on the same kind of authoritarianism, the same kind of despotism. Because the idea is now it's the apparatus of control has gone from the body into the mind. Mm-hmm. And there's all these ways in which he looks at the design of prisons. He looks at the panopticon is one of the famous things he talks about, which is the way prisons are designed for you to be watched from every angle. Right, you're placed in a pan all opticon, you're seen from every angle. You're dissected, you're understood, you're controlled from every angle. So it becomes a form of mind control, rather than
it's
bodily
brainwashing.
violence.
Yeah, they control. That's what even Marcus Garvey said, and others have said. It's the form of slavery. They no longer use the whip and the shackle. Now it's the mind. Right. They enslave the mind. So even Bob Marley quoted Marcus Garvey, saying that none but ourselves can free our minds. Okay, that was a quote from Marcus Garvey's analysis of this is how they're controlling us now. It's no longer chains of slavery because we have been, and again Marcus Garvey was 30 years after the 40 years
after the emancipation of black people in America. And he was on the streets in New York talking about back to Africa. Not just back to Africa. That's one thing, too. People tend to just lock him in that box. But he was talking about being self-sufficient and having our own community. He was talking about separate, not just separate, but equal, not integrated. He was talking about separate
back
community.
to Africa. Right.
Could not only just, even those who don't want to go to Africa, still be connected to Africa and the Caribbean and South America, like black people all over the world. Economic unity. That's what he was on, that. Not just for those who want to should be able to return to Africa, but he wasn't just saying back to Africa.
Right, because the psychological is connected to the economic. That's why you make a really important point when you throw in where I was talking about Foucault. You say, well, they're also going after your livelihood, right? Yeah. They're controlling your workplace. They're controlling your labor. They're controlling your daily, every day you go to work, right? So they're controlling your time. They're controlling your existence on this planet. They're controlling your food.
And if you don't submit to that, then you'll be on your own in the street, where the only recourse left to you is crime.
Sure. And that brings you right back into that system,
exactly.
That recidivism. And that also creates the psychological idea of racism, which is the psychological notion that black people are criminals, that black people are this, that they are that. And that belief system, that those institutions create, that materiality create, the ideational that comes out of the material, then it's like a vicious cycle.
Oh, yeah.
It feeds back into the material.
Well, they've basically criminalized the inner city. They force you that because there aren't job opportunities, there isn't decent housing, there isn't those things that would make life palatable, that would make life satisfying. So you feel like your only alternative, like you said, you're only operating on instinct. You're only operating on survival mode. So maybe I have to go and take this 45 and put it up against somebody's head who look like they have some money.
But then the one aspect of resistance that this creates, and the new problem that they've been dealing with in recent years, because when I went back to California recently, 6 months ago, I went to Inglewood, I went to Oakland, I went to all those places, and I felt like I was in Beverly Hills. And the same thing that I noticed in Harlem, slowly, the gentrification process. D.C. some years ago, right? Baltimore now is dealing with it. Detroit is dealing with it, right? The artists come in, the hipsters come in, the educated people come in. This is what's culturally vibrant, right? And then slowly the yuppies come in, and then the older gentrified people come in, and suddenly you have the dispersal of these communities. Because as long as all these communities are huddled together in the inner city, even if they are exposed to drugs, even if they are exposed to all kinds of oppression, they're kind of in it together, and it becomes a petri dish for all kinds of cultural reinvention. It's the avant-garde, right? It's the forefront of cultural or artistic invention, is in those spaces. And the next move is to gentrify those spaces such that you now you destroy those communities, and you disperse these people to the edges of the urban landscape as well as the popular consciousness. And so you understand what I mean? Where, like, to me, gentrification, it's kind of like the way people talk about adoption, right? Like the adoption of Ethiopian babies by Europeans, which I personally don't mind. But the way people talk about it is like, oh, now they're even coming after our kids. They take everything from us. Now that even the kids we're going to take and make ours. Okay, well, to me, it's like gentrification is the like, oh, even that space for resistance, we're going to find a way to infiltrate that space. Or, you know, the white savior imagery of films like Avatar or Dances with Wolves or The Last Samurai.
We're going to fix it.
Even the resistance to white dominion has to be led by Kevin Costner and Tom Cruise, the Australian guy who dons the mask of the native in Avatar. In order for that, and then suddenly it becomes effective. Whoop-de-doo. As long as we're leading resistance to ourselves, now it's because that's how much more powerful we are.
Lawrence of Arabia, that's
sure.
not a new idea
Lawrence,
either.
Yeah.
So, you know, there's...
That's a good point, Lawrence of Arabia. I'd forgotten about that.
There's a lot of psychological warfare that's been unleashed upon our population for men. I mean, again, just the very fact that you would go to the continent and put a boatload of people on this boat and then take them to another place and subject them. Like, again, you put them in chains. You treat them like chattel, like animals. Like, you put them on top of the deck and you say dance around and you squeeze some in their mouth so they don't get scurvy, but yeah, and you know, make an attempt to feed them, but basically you don't really care about these people. You hose them down because they've been in this filth, You hose them down and you send them right back in there.
Correct.
And until you get to your destination, and then you march them out, and then you proceed to buy and sell these people.
Precisely.
So, right there, the whole process is psychological. Like you rip these people from their homeland where they were free. They might not even been comfortable. They might have been at war with the neighboring tribe or something, whatever. But they were free, and now you've enslaved them. Like they might have been a prisoner of war, which normally in the society, prisoner of war was treated good. You just farm this land for a little while. You help me out and repair some of the damage you did when you came in here chopping up stuff, and then we'll send you back to your own area, no problem. Or you go somewhere else, or you marry one of our kids and stay here. That's how they did it before. But when this other industry came in and said, "Oh, we can take these cats and sell them to the white dude and get guns," that's a better deal for us.
So it's like Iran-Contra all over again. Take you hostage, sell you and get armaments.
It's nothing new. There's nothing new under the sun. Again, if you look at these people as less than human, then you can basically do whatever you need to do in order to enrich yourself. And you can utilize those people because that's part you got them in your spreadsheet as resources, not people, not labor. Resources. I own this. I own them. So what I want them to do, they'll do. If it's clean the house, if it's plant a field, if it's whatever it is, if it's have kids so I can have more slaves. You do what I tell you to do. That's a whole different mentality. And then the people who are subjected to that. And if you raise up, if you look up and stuff, the lash, the whip, limb taken off. So you are forced to, okay, boy, I better behave myself because I want my feet and I want my hands. I need to, hold my tongue, what I really want to say to this dude, because I might lose my life. And have to think about that. Who has to think about that? And parents have to teach their children that. Don't look up at Mr. When he talk to you, say yes, sir, and then you just do this and you do exactly what he tell you to do. You know what I'm saying?
I completely agree.
It's a mental process. It's not something that just happens overnight.
And it's also when we acknowledge this, one of the things that I think Black people are people of historically subjugated backgrounds. That includes women, that includes colonial subjects, that includes the majority of the population of the world by far, right? Even poor white people, One thing to remember is acknowledgement is not the same as anger, right? Like you don't have to be angry, right? Right now you speak as an older person with all this wisdom, with all this knowledge, with the ability to connect all these things, and you acknowledge all these things that a lot of people would use or misunderstand for anger. Mm-hmm. But you don't get angry. Your tone is completely even keeled the entire time. Acknowledge, almost like a scientist or like a historian, right? Like in an academic sense where you're detached from the reality, even though you're not. No, none of us are. But you speak as though you're detached from the reality and you're detached from the emotion that this breeds in you. Well, and only then can you really kind of navigate that terrain.
That takes practice. And again, like I said, I'm 63 years, 64 this year. So I've had a lot of time to think about a lot of these issues.
Sure.
And express myself. And then sometimes I have to re-evaluate and re-examine some of my point of view.
Right, self-education, once again.
Because that's what that's all about.
Yeah, that's one of the things I've loved with... that's one of the things, sorry to cut you off. That's one of the things I've loved about getting older, is that now I have space and I have time to think, to reconsider, to reflect on my past, to reflect on other people's stories. And suddenly I'm realizing how stupid young people are, how stupid I was when I was young. Like, the potential is there, but there's also so much that you miss out on by not having had that sort of lassitude of time to just sit back and reflect, be self-critical, as you put it.
Well, and again, like I said, when I was younger, I had my poetry to express myself. And a lot of times people would describe me as an angry black poet, angry, because some of my pieces, when I would express it, I would get loud, or I would show on my face my utter disgust.
Sure.
For a certain
That's
realities.
what the outlet is there for. Right?
Exactly. So, but that's also cathartic too, because once it's out, then it's not something that's plaguing my mind.
Sure, I'm dealing with that too right now because I write mostly essays or I write nonfiction. Right, I read about history. I read about a lot of the stuff that we talked about just now, right? Either racial history or arts, literature. That whole thing about Shakespeare. It's a chapter that I've written recently, right? Or I'll talk about social theory about Foucault, Gramsci. But I cannot help, and it's very difficult for me in the editing process to be like, how much of this should I cut out when I start expressing emotion, when I start expressing anger, when I start really more than anything pain about the relationship with the past, the past that's lost. Pain about knowing how much other people, like the injustices of the world, the whole last shall be first shall be last, all the ironies and the projections, the denials, the false prophets, observing the hypocrites as they would mingle with the good people we meet, right? All of those moments, they weigh me down in a way that I can't really express unless I'm writing. And so as a result, I lose that sense of academic objectivity detachment. And for a long time, I would go back in the editing process and I would try to tone it down such that I sound more academic and I can make my argument sound more objective. But over time, now I'm realizing, it's good that there's a little bit of that poetry in the essay writing.
Sometimes you have to express the anger.
Yeah.
Like, again, I like to go back to Stokely Carmichael as a figure. Like, when he started, he was with SNCC, Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. And he was one who replaced Farmer as the president of SNCC because his point of view, he wanted to be more active. He wanted to do more things, not just sitting down at lunch counters, but going to register disenfranchised communities like en masse to vote and things like that. He wanted to be more active. And James Farmer was more, he wanted to practice like Dr. King, passive resistance.
Correct, yeah.
Okay, so they replaced him as a leadership, and Stokely also, Kwame Ture, started to take on the rhetoric of the Black Panthers and the power. We need power. We need power to the people. Even when they were in, I think it was it Birmingham or one night before, he was like standing right next to Dr. King, but he was saying, tell those racist crackers that all the scared niggas is dead. We ain't afraid of them no more. You know what I'm saying?
Who said that?
Stokely Carmichael.
Stokely said that.
Yeah, and Martin Luther King was standing right next to him. But he said, we need to let them know that all scared niggas is dead. We ain't scared. You know what I'm saying? We are fearless in demanding our rights. And that was it was a mental shift,
right.
The generational shift. Dr. King was a little uncomfortable with that, but he didn't tell Jesse.
Right.
He didn't tell Stokely to shut up.
Right.
You know
He can't really.
But there came a time when the SCLC said, okay, we got to separate from these SNCC boys because they're getting a little too radical.
Yeah.
You know what I'm saying? So that happened.
SNCC means Student Nonviolent Coordinating.
Yes, Student Nonviolent Coordinating.
A little bit of a further.
And he said, we are nonviolent, but then we're not going to let no cracker come over there and crack us on the head. With no stick.
Then you got to defend yourself.
Then we're going to defend ourselves. Right. We're going to be like what Malcolm X said. Right. We're going to defend ourselves by any means necessary.
Whereas Dr. King was like, no, turn the other cheek. Keep turning the other cheek as hard as it is. And that is another aspect.
It was a moral argument. He's saying that if we show this on television, then we'll convince good-thinking Christian people. Maybe we'll see the immorality
around the world.
Of this. And see
it's
how
a very effective strategy. He was right. But then there were other aspects of the strategy that are forgotten.
It didn't work to the degree that he
not
thought
to the degree. But it's also because he put it in the context of also the economic arguments, the anti-war arguments.
Well, then he started now he became more dangerous.
Right.
It wasn't just
budgets are moral documents.
It wasn't just march these brothers and let them get beat up. It was more like, no, we are marching for this purpose. We're marching for that purpose. He also said jobs and so. But he also said America has, rugged individualism for the poor and socialism for the wealthy. Right, so that might not be the exact words, but that's basically that's one of Martin Luther King's later pronouncements. They expect you to pull yourself up by your own bootstraps, but that's not how they got it.
No, not from the Homestead Act to after World War II when they started giving away the GI Bill to nobody pulls themselves up. America is a country founded on the illusion of self-reliance. Everybody relies on somebody else.
There were people who pulled themselves up, but again, like I said, a lot of the activity that was illegal.
And also, there's that. It's illegal. Secondly, even the illicit networks still have a collective. I mean, you watch Goodfellas at the beginning. What is Paulie there for? Paulie is for people, wise guys who need protection, who couldn't go to the cops. That's all the organization was about. It's even they needed somebody to help pull them up. They have wives who help, and mothers who help pull them up, and daughters who help pull them up, right? So the idea that, well, you get the point. This idea that it depends, especially when you have somebody working your fields for you, doing your labor for you for hundreds of years, for you to then lecture that person about, hey, you really need to rely on yourself, man. I'm not gonna sit here giving you out handouts, right? I mean, the irony of it, it's comical if it wasn't so. But I do agree that probably part of the reason Dr. King is killed is that shift towards talking more economic, more anti-war, more radical kind of discourses. It's hard to imagine he wasn't, because he was such a powerful figure who had convinced so many people that he was more dangerous than any of the more radical people. Because the radical people, some people would never listen to Malcolm X after he had said that the white man is the devil. They would go, oh, this is the guy who said the white man is the devil. But the guy who talked about I have a dream and who reached people's hearts, once he starts saying things about the economy and about the military-industrial complex and the war, then that's the guy who has to go.
Yeah.
No, the more you think about it, Martin Luther King had to go.
No, same thing with Malcolm X. When he changed the rhetoric from the Nation of Islam, he was no longer part of the Nation of Islam, and he said, I don't agree with the blanket statements. And I went to Hajj with people from Algeria who were white skinned and blue eyes and blonde hair. And he's African, and he's a Muslim, and he's my brother. And so I can't say that blanket white man is the devil.
Right.
I'm starting to read the Quran. I'm starting to understand the Arabic of what it says, and there's nowhere in there that it talks about
white man being the devil. Well, also the theology of the Nation of Islam, I think at some point Malcolm had to confront more than the moral issues about Elijah Muhammad.
I think that was the main issue for him, because he himself adopted the moral code of the Nation of Islam. Like full on.
Well, the moral code is fine, in my opinion. But the theology is a little nuts.
I'm saying
Although
that,
you say that about a lot of religions.
the even a lot of the hierarchy of the nation weren't as, like I said, as moral as he was. Like he took one wife. He was faithful.
No corruption. He didn't live in a big house or a big car.
The FBI approached him. He would not become an informant even after he left the nation. Like all of these things that Malcolm was principled.
Right.
But there were
10 years in jail will do that for
There were people in the nation who had been to prison too, who took the payout from the man.
Sure, probably Baines and some of these other people.
Again, he was a fictional character, but he was like,
Well, Baines is based on the guy who raises him up. What's his real name? The guy, or not the guy who...
He was a composite of...
Right, because
Elijah's sons.
Because that character is also...
Sure. The people who were... whispering in Elijah's ear, he's trying to take over.
Because Baines is a useful, I mean, first of all, you have to tell a story within a few hours, but even that is an interesting example. The Mr. Baines character, because I thought he was a historical figure, but I remember that in the book, and therefore in history, it was Malcolm's brother, who comes, because he's from Detroit Red. Right? And Detroit is where W.D. Fard, who's supposed to be God, meets Elijah Muhammad. It's one of the centers. So there's a whole community, a whole nation, right? A community, a city, a family that's really behind who Malcolm is. But just as we have a tendency with civil rights history to reduce it to great man theory, right? That Dr. King, Malcolm X, their biography, their face, as a rallying cry, as a galvanizing strategy to bring people, because people need that role model. People need someone to look up to, right? And that's why
Elijah Muhammad, like I said, at the time, and you have to understand his historical context. So he was a Garveyite. Right. He came out of the Garvey movement, so he saw the things that worked with Garvey, like the pageantry, the militancy, like the men in uniform, and doing drills and being like smart and looking like a militia. Like, they would hold the flags, but they would, do them like spears, and they was like military trained, and they were also hand-to-hand combat trained. Like the Fruit of Islam was like a army, and that was one of the things that Elijah took from Marcus Garvey's origin, because Marcus Garvey had a black corps too, in red, black, and green uniforms.
Sure, yeah.
He had a nurse's corps. He had all of these things that were pageantry. Like when black people saw it, they said, "Oh, look at they look so good. They all dressed alike and they marching in unison." Those things have an effect on your mind when you see those.
Yeah.
And so Elijah brought that pageantry to, but
absolutely,
he put it in a religious.
And that's also what Malcolm says when he talks about why he got into the nation. He saw little kids, little black children, the way they're dressed, the way they spoke, the tone of their voice, their kindness, their wisdom, the way they pray, the respectful, and he goes, beautiful.
Yeah.
Right? In the book, he just goes, beautiful.
And
this is what I want to be a part of, right? It's not really about the theology. It's never really been about Islam, because again, the Nation of Islam is not Islam. Their theology has nothing to do with Islam.
Again, but the theology, if you to oppress people in America,
right,
who especially have been oppressed by white people in particular, that was very attractive, even if you didn't become a member of the nation.
Sure, the whole thing with Yaqub,
even if you didn't accept the whole complete doctrine of it, like the big head scientists and gene grafting and all of those. The idea.
Right. Well, it's just like how Mormons are some of the nicest and most disciplined and kind people, and then you read their theology and you're like, what is this about magical underpants? And how Jesus walked around in North America and he smote the Indians' skin red because they didn't believe in him and all that. I mean, it sounds completely crazy. And then you meet the people, and just like Malcolm X says, I mean, the way they behave, it's beautiful. But I want to get back to the Baines character real quick, because I think that there's an interesting thing that character shows. Because I remember thinking, okay, whoever this Baines guy is in the movie, if he's based on somebody or not, that's not what happens in the book. And that's one aspect where Spike Lee completely goes against, and for storytelling purposes, sure. The guy who elevates him, and there's the whole nutmeg scene, right? Like the shower scene, and then later on when Malcolm confronts him about the truth about Elijah, and he denies it, he goes, "You use a nutmeg now." And he goes, whoa, be careful. Be careful. And that's the first indication he's going to get killed, right? And Baines turns on him, right? So he becomes a Judas figure. But just like we need hero worship, right? Mm-hmm. Great man theory to rally around these heroes, and this is a conscious strategy, right? We need to boil down into what you call the composite, right?
And also, the idea has to be perpetuated that it was the Nation
that
of
killed
Islam
him,
that killed him.
Right. And Spike Lee suggests, well, the CIA was following him, they were watching him. Right, they do have the comment as they're listening. They're like, "This guy's a saint compared to King." Right? There are moments like that in the film. And there are moments like that in a lot of popular representations of Malcolm. Well, listen, of course he was a threat, but it always comes out to the nation is the one that killed him. Which of course they had the motive.
They were the trigger man. But
course.
Again, who provided the guns?
Yeah.
Who called the New York police and the task force that was following and watching Malcolm all the time? Who called them away that day?
Right.
I mean, that day there were 2 police on the roof. And the police didn't come until after the call came out that Malcolm was shot.
Right.
That's when all the police came on force onto the scene. And the people had caught one of the assassins.
Right.
The people themselves caught one.
And don't forget also, for people who don't know, Malcolm dies in 65.
Mm-hmm.
65, the world is a different place from the time that Dr. King dies 3 years later in 68, and Bobby Kennedy dies, and Wallace is shot, and everybody's getting shot everywhere. You know what I mean? By then you have the death of the 60s. You have Altamont the next year, right? You have Woodstock the next year. You have this descent into madness, and the dream, and you have Nixon gets elected when Bobby Kennedy dies. Nixon gets elected that November. The most right-wing guy. And that's really the indication the 60s is over. The dream is over, right? This is not descended into violence. You have the law and order vote.
And he started off his administration with the trial of the Chicago 7.
Sure.
So, put all of these people together who weren't even in the same room on any given day, but he put all of them together as conspirators of what happened in Chicago during the Democratic National Convention. All 7 of them because of like isolated things that they said over a period of days. None of them were, again, only a few of them were even in the same area at the same time. But they put them all together on trial because they wanted to make a statement against each one of those groups. Each one of those people represented, one was anti-war, the Yippies were just anti-society, the Black Panthers were revolution in the black neighborhood. Like, everyone had their own agenda, but they put them all together on that trial.
And they were all understood to be innocent. They were all understood to be innocent. Like, and it's in the tradition of Sacco and Vanzetti, you know, the Italian anarchists, the immigrants who were killed. And now, you know, just like we call it the Chicago 7, we also use the terms of the Central Park 5. Donald Trump built a lot of his career in politics with saying, I want these guys dead, even though he knew and his followers knew that they were innocent. It was almost like, yeah, it's this brazen, like, yeah, I just want to shed some black blood here. That's who I really am.
Yeah, no,
I'm going to take out a page in the paper saying, just kill these guys, even though we know that they did not do it, right?
No, there was no tangible proof offered, and again, their confessions were coerced by police. The police tactics that they used to get confessions from kids was completely illegal.
Yeah.
But this is how police acted in that, and again, still act.
Sure.
These things haven't changed. Again, there's directives from J. Edgar Hoover for law enforcement to be creative in ways to get these people off the street, get them in jail, or kill them, neutralize them. That was the word he used.
Neutralize them, yeah, right.
You know what I'm saying? Be creative, neutralize them. I talk about Geronimo Pratt.
I first came across that term and neutralized them in a Rage Against the Machine song, where Zach De La Rocha repeats that over. He goes, and neutralize them.
Yeah,
that's the key statement. And neutralize them.
That
right?
memo from J. Edgar Hoover.
Sure. Everything is to neutralize.
It's to get rid of, eliminate, neutralize, discredit. So use informants, use local police. Local police, be creative in your methods.
Sure, yeah.
And then we'll aid you, because we'll send in the informant that says, oh, I know the Black Panthers bought guns yesterday. Well, how do you know that? I sold them to them. Where did you get them? I got them from, I can't tell you that, but we got them from the FBI. But I sold them to the Black Panthers, so you need to get in there and get those guns from them. Because they about to do something bad, or, you know what I'm saying, that's what I'm a member of the Black Panther Party, so I'm telling you this.
Right.
So, but he's not letting you know I'm an informant, a paid informant for the FBI.
No.
He's not going to say that.
Right.
But that's what he was. That's what they all were. And then the police, the local police, oh, well, they got these weapons in there. We got to move in heavily armed. And we got to shoot first and ask questions later. And that's how they handle a lot of the entries and incursions into Black Panther headquarters all over the country. And it disrupted they couldn't do breakfast programs because all their leadership is in jail. They now got to take their resources to raise bail money or attorney's fees. So they were using every method they could to disrupt the Black Panther Party. So that mass jailing was just one strategy. And then they cut out who are the leaders. Okay, we got to harass them. Put the gangs on them. Oh, send a letter to this gang leader and say, they trying to get rid of y'all. Forge a letter in the name of some of these leaders and say, oh, we need to get rid of these black guys. We need to take over the drug dealing and get us some money, or we need to do this. And it was the FBI writing these letters and sending them to the gang leaders and sending the Panthers, oh, the gangs is arming to get rid of y'all. So now the Black Panthers feel like, we trying to help the people, but these gangs is trying to sell drugs to our people. So now we become enemies. Right. But where are they getting the drugs from? Right. All of those things they work together. Right. They showed you that the police were very heavily involved in drug dealing in New York. They would arrest the drug dealer, not even arrest him, pull him over, take his product. Okay, every week you're going to deliver to me this amount of money.
Yeah. I mean, they show that in a lot of the crime film genre. I mean, in Scorsese's stuff, in William Friedkin's film, The French Connection, and so on.
In the American Gangster.
Yeah, the Denzel Washington. I forget the director's name, but yeah, with Russell Crowe. But I mean, it's interesting though, because, and I want to get your take on this. I think we discussed this off air, but Black Lives Matter. The fact that the focus is on the police. Listen, yes, I as a black man who was living in New York when Eric Garner was killed, before I came here, yeah, there was some apprehension about the police, but it wasn't necessarily that you were gonna be killed. It was that you might be stopped and frisked, you might be annoyed, it might be tense. I didn't fear being killed or being the victim of a hate crime nearly as much as I was constantly dealing with and was being irritated by what they call the microaggression. The microaggression, a lot of white people roll their eyes and go, oh, every little thing bothers you, you're so sensitive. Would you rather be the victim of one, maybe two hate crimes in your life and survive them, as long as you survive them, of course, or would you, without massive bodily harm or anything, or would you rather deal with, on a daily basis, being seen through the prism of your color, being judged that way, having to deal with all this passive-aggressive microaggression stuff? I'd take the hate crime a million times over, especially because when you're the victim of the hate crime, people can't deny it, and they're like, oh, wow, you were the victim of the hate crime. The microaggression, oh, get over it, and you're told to get over it, 10 times a day. And so the thing with the police is, as much as I do think police reform is necessary and all that, they became the scapegoat a little bit, especially for liberal people. Oh, it's the police, the cops are racist, the cops are... As if racists are these, the way people talk about racism, especially in Ethiopia, when they think about racism, they think, racism means, somebody runs up to you and calls you the N-word, or, throws you, in Teza, how they get in this film. The Ethiopian immigrant in Germany is, thrown off a staircase because that's what white people, what racists do. It's the racists are the evil people in the corner there, and everybody else is pure at heart. Which is not how it works. It's not how it works here. So with tribalism, it doesn't work that way anywhere. The thing about the police is, and they talk about this in Selma, right? For decades, in entire regions of the South, a black person any white person had the right of life or death over black. So Black Lives Matter is what created the blue state, red state map as it is today. It's the reason the Republicans vote Republican in the states that they do. Because they did that in reaction to black people getting the right to vote. And black people got the right to vote. The push for that wasn't just for democracy, but more importantly, Black Lives Matter. Because in order to serve on a jury, you had to be registered to vote. And because there were no black people on these juries, there were all these all-white juries. As in the movie Selma, the Dr. King character says to the President of the United States, he goes, in order to serve on these juries, you had to be registered to vote. So you have these all-white juries, and they're the ones acquitting any white person for killing any black person, and everybody knows it. Think about the power dynamic that is created when every time you interact with somebody, based on your outward appearance, that person could kill you for any reason and get away with it, scot-free.
Yeah, well, that's and the police were doing it under the color of authority.
True.
So that's why the police, again, when you really understand the dynamic of why in a country like America, because America was founded on militias.
Right.
You defend your own home. You have your own gun in your house.
Second Amendment.
Okay. So the police force was formed to catch runaway slaves.
Right.
That's where local police come from.
Right.
So their whole mandate was, we got to get those niggas. And some of the people that they would arrest or sweep up were free black people. If you couldn't prove right there on the spot that you were free, you were gone. And if you talked too strong, you might be hung up on a tree. They might take you to jail in the daytime, but at night they coming to hang you up. And they put a sign on you. This nigga tried to vote. This nigga talked back. This nigga looked me in my eyes. So that's how the police, just because they were law and had a badge on, they did not have your interests at heart. That's how black people in America grew up, but understanding their role is to just be on us. Them being in our community is to police us. It is not to protect our homes and our property. They do that in white neighborhoods. In our neighborhood, they coming to get us, take you to jail, kill you. You know what I'm saying? There was a whole slew of jail suicides. Cats caught hanging themselves with their belt. But the first thing they take from you when you go into jail is your shoestrings and your belt. So how did they get a belt to hang themselves? No, is a lynching took place inside the jail.
Right, ask Jeffrey Epstein.
So these things happen. So it's not paranoid. It's not.
No.
black people have been victims of police, and when police pull up behind us, we get the hair on the back of my neck used to stand up just if police would look at me.
But do you think it's a different relationship at the same time? Because I would always be much more scared if I'm walking around in New York City, depending on how I'm dressed, how old I am, and so on, and much more scared until I start talking, right? Like like I've had the police call to for noise complaints and stuff to my house when I was living in the suburbs. It's a different relationship, right? It doesn't mean I'm not scared. It's that I think I can talk my way out of this probably just by being quiet and only speaking to answer questions. And just being the eloquent guy and the suburbanite,
yes.
I mean, zip code, class, the way you talk, your education level, the way you're dressed. They and on some level, look, I know this is going to sound bad, but on some level, the police have to profile you because they walk into a situation that can erupt at any point in time. The question is, can they use force, especially deadly force, as a protective measure against anybody who they perceive as a threat? That's where it gets.
I said the fact that they profile and look at black people as if they are potential threats. A lot of that is the problem.
Right. Okay.
Because again, there's a movie, one of the first movies I saw Lawrence Fishburne in when he was young.
Oh, Boys in the Hood.
Cornbread Earl and Me. This is.
I don't know.
Okay, Cornbread Earl and Me. It starred Lawrence Fishburne when he was like maybe 13 years old.
Oh, right around when he did Apocalypse Now, right when he was
before that.
Yeah, right
before Apocalypse Now. It was because of Cornbread Earl and Me. He got Apocalypse Now.
Okay.
He was 16 when he made that. He had experienced a growth spurt.
Sure.
But Cornbread Earl and Me, he was still a little skinny little kid.
Uh-huh.
And the object of the story is a basketball hero in his neighborhood. Every day, this dude would work out, play his basketball because he was going to college. He was going to the pros. Like he was that dude. And everybody was proud of him in the neighborhood. And after he didn't do no drugs, he didn't get involved in no gangs or nothing like that. After he practiced, he would go to the local store, get him an orange soda, and then he'd run home with his orange soda. And one day now, it's in the rain, and he's running home with his orange soda, and the police see something in his hand, and it flashes, and because they was chasing a murder suspect.
That's why I thought you were talking about Boys in the Hood, Gary, because that's a very similar scene to Boys in the Hood with the black guys who shoot the the athlete.
So
I must have heard of that film somehow to make that confusion.
And the pivotal point in the scene is that Lawrence Fishburne's character, has to testify in court that Cornbread was just running down the street with an orange soda like he does every day.
Sure.
And the police didn't even say stop or nothing. He just saw something in his hand and shot it.
It's like the Skittles in the hoodie in the George Zimmerman Trayvon case. Or the wallet in the Amadou Diallo
Police
case.
are just, when they see a black person, they think the worst first.
Sure.
And that is historical conditioning.
I don't disagree with you there. I didn't mean to suggest that I accept profiling in that sense. I'm saying that to profile people, to make assumptions about people when you walk into a dangerous situation,
it's policing.
It's part of policing.
It's modern policing.
It's just that particular assumption and the degree to it and the way it can become so much more volatile.
That's they've created that dynamic because America, at the beginning, according to the Constitution, is that these communities should be policing themselves. That was the Black Panthers.
Sure.
The Black Panthers
stance is we should be policing ourselves.
We should police ourselves. Right. And if you come into our neighborhood, we're going to observe you and your arrest. Right. And we will be armed. Sure. So you will not abuse or kill that black person on the street.
It's a phenomenal idea. I love it because also it's in the context of this communitarian thought that we discussed before, where when we say police ourselves, it's not just the violent aspect of the police or the retributive justice of the police. It's also social provisioning. It's also health. It's also education. Whatever meeting the needs of the community are, the police is one of a broad array of services.
If you do all of those things, then people don't have crime as their recourse to survive.
Correct.
If everybody has decent housing and food to eat, and they're able to fulfill themselves in a livelihood of their choice, or even if there's just an average wage, like factory job available to them, those people, a lot of them would be happy with that. With just a warehouse job or a factory job. They're not demanding that they be intellectually stimulated in their job. They just want to make enough money to pay for their rent or house note so they can own the house after, if they work here for 25 years. They should own their house at the end of that. Like, this is what people feel the American dream should be. Not to feel like these people are in your neighborhood watching you to make sure that you don't do something that they are already doing. You already know that the police are working with drug dealers and working with, so if they victimize you, you're going to be automatically angry. I'm a working man. I got a job. It may not be a high profile, a job that I dropped out of high school in 10th grade, so I was lucky to get this job. So this person is not going to be able to eloquently express themselves to the police.
Because they've had those tools of expressing themselves taken away from
angry.
them.
Why are
well,
you
this is Caliban again. You taught me a language, and my profit on it is I learned how to curse. Right? This is what is meant when they're pulled over, and the Hueys and the other guys and the Panthers, they're following the cops, following the people they pulled over, and they go out and they're like, according to the legal blah 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 blah, blah you may not blah 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 blah. And they're basically reading the cop his rights, right? And once they're doing that, that's Caliban speaking to Prospero, going, you taught me language, and my profit on it is I learned how to curse. This is why, they say a black person who reads, who's literate, who has a curious mind, who finds an interest in these kinds of things, and a parent who inculcates, or at least who cultivates that
and
kind
encourages
of
them.
Yeah. That's one of the themes of the show is pedagogy, is child education and child rearing.
To me, that's the most important. Like, again, I teach in schools here in Addis Ababa, but my approach is I don't want to follow the standard British or American education that they want to impose on young Ethiopians. I want to share with them some of the common history that we have. A lot of people don't know that an African American came here during Menelik's time to open a bank.
That I did not know.
His name was William Ellis. In America, he called himself, because he was born in Texas, he was born near the border, so he could speak Spanish, close to Mexico. And so at one point, he was light-skinned, so he called himself Guillermo Elisano. And he pretended to be a Mexican so that he could open some banks in the South, in Texas. And he catered to black people, and he became a millionaire. And he invested in the stock market, and he became a multimillionaire. So he came to Ethiopia to meet Emperor Menelik, who had defeated the Italians in the Battle of Adwa. He wanted to meet this dude, and he okay, we got the same mentality. And he came to Ethiopia, and he talked to Tikur and Menelik and said, I want to open a bank that will connect African Americans with Ethiopia. So he went back to America. When he came back, he was on a ship with the Secretary of State, who proceeded to talk bad about this black man who had nothing but good intentions to try to open up Ethiopia to international commerce. He talked to him like, this guy's a con man. He wants to try to take advantage of you. And so he totally dissuaded Menelik of the idea of we're a country. We're the United States of America. We can do this and we can do that for you. And so that's when they allowed, the only thing America did was help with the telephones at that time. Telephone and telegraph. And the French came and built a railroad to Djibouti for themselves, but they said, okay, Ethiopians can use it.
Right.
But I'm saying that this was if black people came here wanting to do business, these entities would swoop in and dump a bunch of money and say, no, do it our way.
Right. The very imagery of it is threatening to them. Like, wait, well, what is that? A black person, another black person in a different context?
Go to Colonel Robinson during the Haile Selassie time. Colonel Robinson came and started flying planes. Now, he didn't fight in combat. He just did reconnaissance. Okay, they're gathering over here.
This is the gentleman you mentioned earlier.
Yeah, Colonel John Robinson. He came. He was a pilot who taught himself to fly because, again, segregated America. They did not have any schools for pilots for black people. He was the one who started the first one in Chicago. But he learned, he taught himself. Similar to how Frederick Douglass taught himself to read. He would go and say, he worked as a janitor at a flight school, and then he would go in the garden and pull out notes and
pull out homework for, things that were discarded, books that were left behind. He would take these and peruse, and that's how he learned how to become not only a pilot, but a mechanic too. So when he learned these things, he went up north and opened a school that was catering to black people. They can learn how to fly, they can learn how, and the same thing happened at he went to Tuskegee and helped Booker T. Washington open a program for pilots at Tuskegee, the Tuskegee Airmen. Who exemplified the excellence of black
and then
pilots
there was also
in World War II. And
tests
even so,
that were done on these unethical sort of
Tuskegee, that was the syphilis thing, but the Tuskegee
thing,
Airmen was the first.
Right, the Tuskegee Airmen, sure.
So when Robinson came back to Ethiopia after the resolution of the war and everything, he came back to teach. And he would bring Tuskegee Airmen because they couldn't get jobs as pilots after World War II. They could not get jobs as pilots for TWA and these burgeoning airline companies. So Robinson came with them and they taught Ethiopians how to be mechanics and pilots. That was the beginning of Ethiopian Airlines. But because now these black people didn't have a country or resource behind them to give them planes, Sweden did that. And one of their conditions was, you got to get rid of this Robinson guy.
Sure.
You got to get rid of him because he's kind of, he's uppity and this and that. And,
sure.
You know what I'm saying? Haile Selassie wouldn't do it at first, but then came down to there was a cargo plane that had to be brought to Ethiopia from Sweden. I can't remember. I don't want to disparage any particular country, but it was one of them two countries. And 2 people were supposed to fly this plane, but this major in the Air Force, he was like, no, I'm not flying with a nigger. So Robinson got in the plane solo and flew that plane to Ethiopia. And when he landed and the other guy came in, they said he walked right over to him and just punched him in the jaw. Wow! Knocked him out. Well, of course, this guy goes and complains to Emperor Haile Selassie, and Haile Selassie had to dismiss him because now this is a country that's given us a fleet of planes.
Sure.
And you only brought 1 plane.
Sure.
And even your country didn't even acknowledge you being here. So, I mean, I love you, and matter of fact, you and my son go start a business, and you can fly, you can do your air business, you and my son, but you can't be in the Air Force no more.
I'm pretty sure there might be another story of a black American pilot from World War II in Ethiopia.
Yeah, Hubert Julian too. There was 2 of them that came.
So one of those, there's a friend of the family. I haven't seen him in years, but he's married to a very close friend of the family. He was a filmmaker out in Baltimore. They grew up here, and so a very talented filmmaker who I think bought the rights to a book.
Julian's story is very colorful.
And is going to make that film.
He was from Trinidad and Tobago. Then he was in New York, a member of Garvey. He used to do barnstorming and tricks. Like he would fly a plane, the biplane. Somebody would be piloting. He would jump out with a red, black, and green parachute and land on top of a building or land on a target or land. That was his shtick. He would get, So he came to Ethiopia to do that at Haile Selassie's coronation, which he did. And he got an audience with Haile Selassie. So then, getting that audience with Haile Selassie made him feel like he was in there. So he, among other things, he took one of the emperor's planes on a joyride and crashed it.
Right.
And then also there was reports that he was trying to press up on one of the princesses, Haile Selassie's daughter. And also, him and Robinson also had a problem, too, where it was reported that Robinson knocked his ass out, too. But 2 black people fighting wasn't no big deal, so...
Sure.
But, that Robinson, because Julian's character was a little different than Robinson's. So, that's the story. So then, Julian leaves Ethiopia and comes back to America. And he says some bad things about Haile Selassie. Then he ends up going to Italy and telling them that he's not for Haile Selassie anymore. He was going to work for Italy. But then in his memoirs years later, he said, no, he was actually just fooling that he was actually going to be a spy. It was a secret mission that nobody could know. That's why he picked the fight with Robinson that got kicked out of the Ethiopian Air Force so that he could go to the Italians and say, look, they kicked me out. I don't like them no more. Why don't y'all take me on? And then so he wanted to be a spy. That's what he says. So his story is very colorful. He always dressed a certain way. He was always, and they said he was a ladies' man. He was a womanizer and that type of thing. So he was very flamboyant. And so his story is more exciting than Robinson's. But Robinson was the pioneer who actually brought the plane and started the Air Force and then trained pilots to become Ethiopian Airlines. Robinson did all of that stuff. But Julian did come, and he was part of the Ethiopian Air Force during the war. But then, like I said, those conflicts made him end up getting deported and kicked out. And then years later, he came back. And again, but I read his memoirs, and years later he said, "Oh, that was all just a ruse for him to be a double spy, you know what I'm saying, against the Italians for Ethiopia." But he had to just make his character look bad. So again, if you believe in or not.
So John Robinson,
Colonel John C. Robinson,
and the other gentleman is Hubert Julian. Thank you for that.
No problem.
That's another great example of something that you've
Look
taught
'em
yourself
up.
in that area. Absolutely.
Yeah, no, because again, we didn't get taught these things in our schools. in America.
I don't think we were taught these things here either.
We don't get taught none of the, and I try to even share this with Ethiopian students here today because many don't realize. They think all the Rastafarians are Jamaicans.
Right.
They think the reason why we love Haile Selassie is because he made it rain when he went to Jamaica.
Right. You know, it's funny though. You know how black comedians often make jokes about, like the cliched black comedian is the guy who talks about white people do this and black people do that.
Mm-hmm.
Like white people, even in the original King's Common, white people, they take a break, blah, blah, blah. Well, black people, when we break, Okay. The biggest difference I have seen between white people and black people, especially white Americans and black Americans, is their attitudes towards Ethiopia when they come here. White people, and again, I hate saying this because there are many exceptions to the rule, and I hate sounding like this, but I have many white friends too. You know, I mean, they're nice people, but there's often an obnoxiousness that comes out, almost a sense of like superiority, as well as a sense of like trying to be one of the natives so much that if they meet someone like you and I who have an American accent, they try to play the whole like I'm so much. There's this old thing about the quest for authenticity, and even when I studied at Columbia, when I studied African history at Columbia, a lot of the white kids, and they were conscious of it. Even the white professors who were doing Africa, who were studying Africa, would play into this silly quest for authenticity, like everything is like adventurism. Like I'm going to go out into the rural areas, and like the hippies would go looking for the water spirits, and the academics would go looking for like the gendered pronouns that would unlock African history. Like, it was just like really silly stuff, right? All that is to say, when I run into black Americans here, not just someone like you who's now very familiar with the culture and the history, has been here 15 years and has taught yourself all these things, but I'll meet, I met an Air Force guy. I was thinking while you were talking, I wish you had met him. I'm assuming you hadn't. What was his name? He was a very, very pleasant guy. Bernard was his name. An black Air Force guy who was traveling the whole world. He'd been like 50 countries or something with the Air Force. And he was like, I've never been anywhere like this. I want to come back. I hope he comes back and I run into him in one of these diaspora hangouts. But Bernard's like attitude was like so many black Americans' attitude was just, and this is something I wanted to address earlier too, is that like a lot of times the perception of Africa is it's complete mayhem, it's absolute crap, so and so, war and famine, and of course some of those problems do exist. Just like any other stereotype is rooted in truth, right? But that was the perception that people in America, and I would see, and I would always be really hurt to see some black Americans who would indulge in that about Africa must be like this, Africa be like that, almost to give themselves a sense of pride, like, hey, at least we're black Americans, and we're not nearly as bad as those Africans over there. But then what happens is people are given these images of Africa so much that when they actually come. And they come to Ethiopia. I mean, I saw Chris Tucker on MTV years ago. You ever see that clip of him staying at the Sheraton with Bono and all that? And he's walking around going, "This is the greatest place I've ever seen on earth." Blah, 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 blah. He can't believe he's running into black kids at the schools here, the public schools here, who are dressed the way he would, and are looking at him like, "Oh my God, it's Chris Tucker from Rush Hour." Blah 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 blah. It's this like cathartic thing for a lot of black Americans when they come.
We're taught that first of all, like in the '60s when I grew up, and in school. If somebody called you African, it was an insult.
Right.
You know what I'm saying? That was the attitude. If somebody called you black before
1966, it was an insult.
Right. Negro was the proper term.
Yeah, colored was what the preferred term for a lot of black people. They didn't like the Negro was something Marcus Garvey came up with. A lot of people didn't like that either. Negro sounded a little bit too with the capital N. Oh, that's
Yeah.
that's uppity.
Uppity. Okay, I thought that for a lot of people it sounds too close to the N word, right? Like,
No, they Negro with the capital N because that was supposed to be close to the classical definition of Caucasoid, Malongoid.
Sure, it's Latin.
And Negroid, right? So
all those words are Latin.
So they wanted to take that Latin term, which again to me is that's not what we called ourselves. That's what somebody classified us as.
What did we call ourselves?
Well, again, I'm still looking to learn that. We've accepted Ethiopian because that's what the Greeks called us.
Right. But see, most groups are named by somebody else, right? Because their term for themselves, so, it might be the word like people. For instance, I have a friend who's Nua from a Native American group called Nua, which is just their word for the people. But they had to discover what their word was because they were named the Shoshone, and they're still classified as Shoshone. And he doesn't speak Spanish, but he'll talk to certain Spanish-speaking groups who have that term, and they'll be like, they call it Shoshone, and they're like, oh my god. So he knows that it's some kind of term of disparagement that is the label for that group. But usually people are named by somebody else, right?
So
it's always in relation to somebody
and
else.
whatever we called ourselves has been erased from history. Some people say Al-Kebulan, some people say, other, because Africa itself is a Latin word.
Right, Scipio Africanus. Yeah.
Right. So all of these things I used to think about as a young man. Like, where did this come from? How did that start? Why do we do this? Why do we think that way? Why does everybody want to attain to this particular?
Right. And your curiosity brought you back to the source of.
Yeah, I mean, after a time, again, like I say, when I started to learn as I got older about my great-grandparents' involvement with Marcus Garvey's organization, with Ethiopianism, things that I remember because I visited my great-grandparents in Jersey when I was very young. But I remember seeing the coronation picture of Haile Selassie on the wall. I remember seeing things like that. But at the time, that's Black Jesus. That's how that's what we saw.
You have a Jersey connection.
Yeah, I was my father's side is from Jersey.
What part?
Jersey City, Newark.
Okay, great. Yeah, that's where I think I told you this. That's where that school I mentioned in my high school experience and my the Irish American experience, and in the 20s.
My mother's side is from Pennsylvania, and they met in Ohio. My dad used to work at the Ravenna Arsenal, which is one of the places that was targeted by the Russians because that was a place where they made arms. A little farm play outside, south of Youngstown. No, actually, it's north of Youngstown, outside of my hometown, Ravenna. It's a little town, but they had a arsenal there and an Air Force base, and my father was stationed there after the Korean War, and that's when he met my mother.
That's fascinating. I mean, one aspect of Black history, civil rights history, tied to Jersey that I learned in that high school in a history class in Jersey was Paul Robeson. Paul Robeson, so for people who don't know, we talked about Othello earlier. Paul Robeson played Othello on Broadway and very much was Othello, as far as I can
At a time when they wouldn't, when people, they thought it was sacrilegious to have a black man on stage.
In Broadway, yeah.
And
this is in the 1940s, I think.
Love scenes with white women.
Right.
Because Desdemona was a white woman.
Sure.
In the play. And so they played Othello historically accurate because before that it was John Barrymore with dark skin.
Even since then, I mean, in the 60s, in the context of the Black to Africa movement, Laurence Olivier, this great Shakespearean African, played Othello in a film version, which is fascinating to watch. It's almost like watching Robert De Niro in blackface, which is supposed to be like this back to Africa, glamorization of blackness thing in the 60s. But it's Laurence Olivier, a famous white man, walking around in blackface. So that's odd. And then Anthony Hopkins, more recently, did Othello. So often they'll have white actors still playing the hero because it's just bizarre to have black actors, or it wasn't available for many years.
Yeah,
but so Paul Robeson was also an athlete. He was a football player before in the pre-NFL days of professional football. He was a great linguist who went to Africa and learned a bunch of languages and made films. And he was also a lawyer and in New York and so on. And then
Rhodes Scholar.
Was he a Rhodes Scholar?
He was a Rhodes Scholar. He was also a.
Was he a Rhodes? I had no idea.
What's the key that they get? What was the other honor that he had? He had all of the top collegiate honors.
So he ends up going to the Soviet Union in the early days of the Cold War.
Mm-hmm.
Right, I think right around the time of the Truman Doctrine and of the Greek Communist Party and the early days, the Korean War entry, like late 40s, early 50s. And he's there for a while. He sings the Soviet national anthem. In that, that's the other thing he does. This so I forgot. He's on Broadway also because he has this beautiful, deep voice. He sang "Old Man River" and so on. But if you go look up on YouTube, which I invite anyone to do, you want to listen to the Soviet Union national anthem, the Soviet national anthem in English. The official version is delivered by a black man singing about, we fought for the future, destroy the invader, with Stalin, our leader, etc., Soviet history. The Soviet national anthem in the background, in the voice of a black gospel singer or a black spiritual singer who you would hear doing "Old Man River," right? It's kind of it's a fascinating.
Yeah, well, as long as he was singing "Old Man River," he was okay. But as soon as he went to Russia, then they branded him a communist and they blackballed him.
Sure, they did, and then he eventually came back and was able to live out his days in Harlem, New York. But he's another person that I'm writing about in this book.
Yeah,
because he's another figure that I find.
Character.
Yeah. So that's the Jersey connection. Plus, out there's still a lot of nation out there. There's still a lot of, and also practicing Muslims. Sort of an extension of the connection to Harlem, runs into North Jersey, into the Newark area.
Oh well, even there was a special documentary.
Yeah.
Who Killed Malcolm X? It was a Muslim man who took it upon himself, did the research himself, and went to offices and pulled Freedom of Information Act papers from. So he tracked down to find out who actually were the triggermen, and he documents. Again, this is documented. You check this. It's a 3-part or 6-part. I can't remember now. Documentary. And this guy determines that it was these 5, the hit squad was 5 gentlemen from the Newark Nation of Islam branch. That they were the trigger men. That one of them, the guy shot in the leg, was caught. That at some time he gave the authorities all 4 names. The 2 guys that they had arrested along with him, like later, they wasn't there at the Audubon. He was arrested at the Audubon because he got shot in the leg, and he dropped his gun and somebody picked it up and shot him as he was trying to run.
Right.
So he didn't get away. And at first he didn't say nothing, but he did say these 2 guys had nothing to do with it. He said that from the beginning. Do you know they only just now paroled those 2 guys? I mean, one of them is out. But they just took that off of their record, expunged their record just now, the other day. They did that. But it's in the record that they had nothing to do with it. He named the other 4 people that were in concert with him. And those guys were revered in their community. Like they were looked upon, even though they had done prison time in it, but they had turned their life around through Islam, and they were community activists, and they built centers for the kids or things like that. So they became revered. Nobody doesn't talk about what they, but I'm saying that these, even though they were the trigger men, they were given a free reign. They were able to drive from Newark. They were not, but who they arrested was 2 members of the Harlem Mosque, in addition to the one that was caught on the scene. They arrested 2 members from the Harlem Mosque because they wanted to get rid of them. And they put them in jail for that shooting of Malcolm. And they weren't anywhere near. Like one guy was saying he was at home. He had been to the doctor earlier that day because he had a leg problem. And so he was at home resting his leg when he found on the news that Malcolm was killed. And then they came to his house later and arrested him because he was one of the leaders of the Fruit of Islam in Harlem, one of the ones that was trained by Malcolm. And the other guy. And then these guys, they were vocally against, because Malcolm had spoke against the minister, Elijah Muhammad. So they had disassociated themselves with Malcolm. They was not fans of Malcolm. They said if they'd have had the gun or the plan, they would, but they couldn't. They said they knew they couldn't do that because the people around Malcolm knew them. So it wouldn't have been logical for them to go to try to, because they would have been searched right away. Even if they wasn't searching anybody else, they would have searched them because they knew them. Oh, these is Harlem Mosque people. We can't just let them in without checking them out. But the people that was there from Jersey, they didn't know them. Because you got to remember, there's no internet. It's not all that in the 60s. So somebody could be living in Jersey and you don't know them in New York. If they don't come to New York, you don't know them.
Right.
Anyway.
It's fascinating stuff. I want to thank you again. Personally, not just on behalf of the audience, but personally, I always learn so much from the first time we met at a diaspora hanging out some months ago to the other time when you agreed to come on to today. There's so much wisdom and knowledge that I get from you that you have to impart. So thank you for coming on.
I appreciate you giving me again the platform.
Yeah, absolutely.
People that know me well know I can talk about this stuff for days.
Yeah, I can listen to it for days as well. And we'll have to have